Good morning. Welcome to this RTPI event on the design dimension of planning. My name is Justin Webber and I chair the RTPI Urban Design Network and work at Leicester City Council. Leicester is not the main focus of today's event, but I will update you if I look out the window and see a fox digging up any more major historical figures. Incidentally, the King Richard III Visitor Centre did win an RTPI Planning Award, so I would recommend you visit the city as part of your post-pandemic travel plans. So today's, as you can see from the agenda, we've got quite a range of speakers, hopefully covering the range of the United Kingdom. We've also got speakers, representatives from the private sector, academia, local government and central government. All 500 spaces for this event filled up a few weeks ago, which I think is testament to the quality of the speakers. So the main thing to say is a big thank you for them giving their time today. So the hook of today is ideally useful information relating to the design dimension of planning, contemporary information, things you need to know, ideally that you can take back and apply in your day jobs. This isn't about planners cosplaying being architects, it's about the role of design within planning. So that's policy planners helping set frameworks for facilitating good design, planning consultants better project managing development schemes to achieve that good design, and development management officers and consultees being able to critically assess development schemes coming forward. A couple of quick updates on the event. If you would like to ask questions, there is a questions tab on this programme. So if you type in questions, then my colleague Julie will hopefully pick up on some of them for the 2 Q&A sessions that we have today. There was a recent RTPI design survey, which a number of you happily helped with, so thank you to all those who sent in responses. They're currently being assessed and some more work will come out on that soon. Following this event, the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence has a report being launched, Delivering Design Value, the Housing Design Quality Conundrum. That is a separate event which starts at 12:45. Booking details were included in the joining instructions for this event, but if you've lost them and you want to go to that event as well, then if you just Google Housing Design Quality Conundrum, the Eventbrite link should come up, and booking is still possible for that event. And there is also an RTPI North East event on design, including some good speakers next week on the 15th of December. Again, that's free and online and places are still available. We were due to start with the Chief Planner, Joanna Averley, but technology isn't working in our favour at the moment on that front, so we're going to move to our second speaker, which we're very pleased to have Professor Matthew Carmona, who many of you will have read his books or seen him speak at other events. Matthew is Professor of Planning and Urban Design at UCL, as well as being chair of the Place Alliance. He is an architect planner who researches urban design governance, the design and management of public space, and the value of urban design. He also edits placevaluewiki.net and has written a wide range of influential books, papers, and research studies. His most up-to-date blogs and updates can be found at his website, matthewcarmona.com, or on Twitter. So without further ado, Matthew, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me just show my screen. Is that working?
Yes.
There we are, that's better. Okay, right, let me start. So what I want to talk about this morning is a report that we published a few weeks ago now, called Home Comforts. There we are, that's it, Home Comforts. And well, we all have been living in a shrinking world. 9 months ago, we all used to live in a world where all of our different activities were geographically separated across cities in work and school and home and leisure. And then suddenly on the 23rd of March with COVID and lockdown, the first lockdown, they all came together, or many of those functions for many of us came together in our homes and within our immediate neighbourhoods and within our home communities. And then, of course, we all, more or less, doesn't matter which part of the UK we were in, we've lived a similar trajectory with a sort of gradual release over the summer, and then a tightening up again from September, although the kids went back to school. And then certainly in England, we had another lockdown, and other parts of the UK had similar tightening at that point, and we just moved out of that. So we've all lived through this period when we've been doing things like this seminar today, this event today online, and a whole lot of other things online. We've been working at home and within our neighbourhood a lot more than we have in the past. And increasingly, we've had research that's been published that have showed that in various ways, this period has not been good for us. It's not been good for our mental health, our physical health. Domestic abuse in the home has gone up. Our happiness has been down, and our well-being has reduced as well. So this piece of research that I'm going to talk about is looking specifically at the experience of this period of lockdown and COVID on our homes and our neighbourhoods as a sort of stress testing of those environments, because this period can tell us something about what it's like living, of course, within a pandemic, but it can also tell us about how we can build our cities and towns and villages so that they're more resilient in the future, better adapted to help support a happier and more healthy lifestyle. And ultimately, of course, we may never fully return to the way it was before this period. Certainly our high streets are unlikely to be like they were before. And many of us, I think, will be working at home in future than have been in the past, because we've seen that the technology usually works. So we conducted a survey. It was a Survey Monkey survey. Many of you may have filled it in. During the first lockdown period, it was May to June, and shortly afterwards. I won't say too much about the nature of the survey itself, but it was a range of questions, many of which were closed and some of which were open. And we got 2,500 responses from right across the UK. The survey started with a set of questions about the people who were responding to the survey, all of these sorts of things about their home environment and who they were, so that we could understand, we could later correlate with their experience of lockdown. And partly the reason for asking these questions was to test any bias within the survey, because we started off by sending the survey out through professional networks, and of course if it's all people like us who are responding, then that's not necessarily the best sort of response. But what we found actually once we'd analysed the response was that in most respects the surveys sort of reflected the national picture in terms of house mix and type and tenure and space standards in the home, levels of occupancy, availability of external space. It pretty much matched the sort of national average. And so it could be regarded as a sort of generalised national voice, although certainly within the survey there was a bias towards London. Half the responses were from London. And I think it's fair to say there's a sort of white collar experience more than a blue collar experience reflected in the findings as well. So what did we find? Well, first of all, within our homes, the good news was that most of us found that our homes were comfortable during this period of lockdown. But whilst 2/3 found that they were comfortable, a sixth found that their homes were uncomfortable. So extrapolated across the UK, that would be about 11 million people found challenges living at home, more at home during that period. People living in houses rather than flats were more comfortable, and the higher apartments got, the higher flats got off the ground, the less comfortable they were. Perhaps more concerning, or most concerning, the newer the dwellings were, the more uncomfortable they were. And what we found is that was progressive. So from the earliest respondents were living in homes and apartments from before 1919, and every decade since, they seem to have got more uncomfortable for us, according to the survey findings. Perhaps perversely, key workers were the most uncomfortable. I say perversely in the sense that many of those were still, of course, going out to work and didn't experience lockdown in quite the same way. But I think that cohort certainly reflected more of the blue collar cohort rather than white collar workers, of course. And social renters seemed to suffer the most. Tenure was the strongest predictor of comfort or lack of comfort during lockdown. Owner-occupiers were the most comfortable, followed by social renters. What were the reasons for this, these findings? Well, access to private open space was critical. That was the strongest design-based predictor of comfort. Those who have access to a private garden were the most comfortable, followed by those who had the terrace space, a private terrace space, followed by those who had a private balcony, followed by those who had a shared garden, and those who had none of the above were the least comfortable of all during that period. More space, perhaps unsurprisingly, means more comfort. Dwellings were more comfortable the more rooms they had per occupant, and dwellings with over 5 occupants were the least comfortable in the survey. Most, but not all, were able to work at home reasonably effectively during the period. 7% really struggled, and those who struggled were concentrated to some degree within the social renting sector. Internal design obviously started to matter perhaps more than it had done in the past. There was certainly a more stronger preference for cellularity within the home than had been in the past, and that's because people needed to work at home, they wanted a home office and so forth. But they also wanted better environmental conditions, better daylighting, noise and noise insulation than they had. And we want more. Even those who had great space standards and good external space wanted bigger and better. Perhaps that's just human nature. So some of the keys to success, and a few quotes from the survey. We have a back garden to escape outdoors. We've become gardeners in the training and very much enjoying it. That was one person. Another person here, good Edwardian space standards. They benefited from plenty of space to spread out and quiet corners to live. What about neighbourhoods? Well, again, most of us were comfortable, even more than in our homes themselves. A minority only suffered from poorly designed neighbourhoods, or that was extrapolated across the UK, that would have been about 3 million people. So still of significant concern. Urban was just as good as suburban or rural. We didn't find any difference in terms of level of satisfaction with the neighbourhood across those different types of neighbourhoods. But again, high-rise came out poorly. Those who were living in neighbourhoods with a lot of high-rise development found that their neighbourhoods supported them less well during lockdown. And again, newer came out worse. A progressive deterioration of our neighbourhood experience, the newer the neighbourhood was. Owner-occupiers were the happiest with their neighbourhoods, followed by private renters and then social renters. And interestingly, we found that neighbourhoods didn't seem to compensate for the lack of space or space quality within the home. In other words, if people were not satisfied about their home environment, then living in a great quality neighbourhood certainly didn't completely fill the gap. What were the reasons for the neighbourhood issues? Well, access to parks and greeneries was fundamental. We found that proximity to a park within 5 minutes was the strongest predictor of satisfaction with the neighbourhood, and over 10 minutes there was dissatisfaction. And we found more or less the same when it came to access to shops and other local services. So 5 minutes, strong satisfaction. Over 10 minutes, satisfaction dropped off markedly. So there's been a lot of discussion about a 15 or 20-minute city during lockdown. We found that people really need a 5 or 10-minute city. People wanted more space for walking and cycling on quieter streets, less traffic streets that were particularly prized. And people saw that there was an opportunity of COVID, that even as we begin to move out, we shouldn't forget the gains that potentially we could achieve by reflecting on this period and what people liked and what people didn't like. So again, a few quotes. Larger areas of green space closer by so that I can feel like a normal human being again, this person wanted. somebody else. I don't drive, so it's hard to get to the essential shops without relying on a different household member. Finally, our communities. What did the survey say about communities? Well, we started asking people about their experience of community pre-COVID, and people said that there was a sense of community, although it was usually pretty rudimentary for most people, but nevertheless tangible. Rural was a bit better than urban and suburban in terms of a sense of community pre-COVID. Again, building higher, there tended to be less community in people who were living in apartment blocks and higher apartment blocks. Older meant more community pre-COVID. People lived in older housing stock, had a greater sense of community, and churn seemed to reduce community. So in other words, particularly those people living in the private rented sector, where there's a greater amount of churn, had a lesser sense of community pre-COVID. How did COVID affect that? Well, as we heard in the sort of national press, people certainly felt a stronger sense of community feeling. And that seems to have helped people through these very, very difficult times that we've been facing. But what we found is that community builds community. So it's those places that already had a stronger sense of community that really benefited from a boost to that sense of community. And those that had a much lesser sense of community felt much less of a reinforcement of that sense. And again, higher, newer, and social came off worse, with a lesser boost to the sense of community. But a silver line, most respondents reported that people seem friendlier, people within their community seem friendlier, environment seemed to recover, and people seem to have more time for each other within the community. So people saw some positives. This person said, I now get to enjoy my home with my partner, have really enjoyed making it ours. This person said, we are seeing our neighbours more regularly and talking more when we do see each other. We talked about pavement chalk drawings and so forth that we saw over the summer period, of course, and better wildlife. Some people were grumpy about it's even more people working and living in their home neighbourhoods. This person said they've seen a massive increase in folk exercising locally, and they didn't particularly like that because I suppose they didn't have their neighbourhoods to themselves anymore, and complaining about the curtain twitching and vigilante squad. This person reflecting the London situation, which I think is a particular situation. They said London housing situation is not for living indoors, it's for living outdoors, with the operation of having outdoors with the option of having a bed under a roof. What they were really saying is when you live in a place like London, you accept lower standards within your home in terms of space standards, but you rely much more on the external. And certainly people from London seem to particularly suffer during the lockdown. So finally, the report ended with a series of recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of these now, but just to highlight a few. All new homes and newly converted homes should have mandated access to private open space, even if just to a balcony. We've seen a lot of apartment blocks built without even balconies, and that certainly was very poorly received during this period. And we see movement from government in this area. Without exception, all new and newly converted homes should be built to decent national minimum space standards, such as the nationally described space standards, and in a manner that prioritises good environmental conditions in the home. So people really valued having access to fresh air, daylight, and good noise insulation. On the neighbourhood, the higher and denser we build, the greater the need for us to have access to high quality parks and green spaces and local facilities within the neighbourhood. So as we densify our towns and cities in the future, we should be thinking about those local access to those facilities. And as we found within the survey, that really means no more than 10 minutes walk to local parks and other facilities, shops and so forth. And then finally, social housing should enjoy the same essential amenities as housing for sale or privately rent, including access to the sort of qualities that I've been talking about within the dwelling and neighbourhood scales. So to conclude, the report concludes COVID has put us under huge strain, but has also reminded us of some of the things we value: nature, family, freedom to walk, and community. As we look likely to continue to spend more time in the home environment in the future, as of course more of us work at home, we'll need to build our homes and neighbourhoods as decent places where people wish to spend time in and which we can build better lives. As a housing design audit for England that the Place Alliance published earlier in the year suggested, and certainly this survey confirms, in recent years we have let standards drop. We should learn from the stress test that lockdown has given our homes to build better living environments in the future and to retrospectively adapt those in that we are living in today. If you're interested in reading the full report, then if you go to the Place Alliance website, you can download Home Conference from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. In theory, we're going to now try and get Joanna onto the next presentation.
Hi.
But we're having some challenges with some of the technology. So can we, Joanna, is that you?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, everyone. Morning.
Perfect. Right. Okay. I will just do a quick introduction. And just for context, we'll have a Q&A with Matthew and Victoria after the first three speakers have finished. So Joanna is the new Chief Planner at the MHCLG as of September. She's a town planner with over 30 years experience working across government on major projects and with local authorities, involved with all aspects of planning, research, policy, practice and project delivery. Prior to the most recent role, she was at High Speed 2, where she led on the interface between the railway and its context. Until taking up the role of Chief Planner, she was the London Mayor's Design Advocate and Chair of the London Borough of Wandsworth Design Review Panel. She's worked on major regeneration and master planning projects from Manchester City Centre to the London Olympics, and held a number of senior roles as Senior Manager for Growth and Development at Crossrail 2, Deputy CEO and Director of Design and Planning Advice at CABE, CEO of Centre for Cities, Land Aid, Director for Design at Olympic Delivery Authority, and a number of voluntary roles as well, such as Trustee of the Museum of London Archaeology. So thank you very much, Joanna.
Thanks, Justin, and apologies, everyone. Colleagues at the RTPI, particularly Max, thank you for bearing with us. We've had a bit of an IT fail this morning, and we've been trying to sort things out behind the scenes. So apologies, and apologies to colleagues who've joined the conference. I'm just dialing in from a phone, so apologies for not being able to sort of show some pictures on a topic which is ultimately visual, which is obviously design quality in the built environment. I just wanted to sort of give you a few reflections, I suppose, and then leave you to listen to Victoria and then a panel conversation. Thank you to Matthew for that fantastic presentation of the work that they've been doing. I wanted just to mention the Homes 2030 competition, the winners of which were announced on Friday, which I'd sort of commend to everybody to take a look. That was sort of really starting to think about homes of the future and all these things that we're now very conscious of that we need as individuals, as families and as communities from our homes and our home environments. And the winners are really interesting schemes, but everybody who participates in the competition, including a young person's competition, have really shown how we should be thinking about what we want from our home environments much more holistically going forward. And in particular, I'd just like to mention the survey that was carried out as an input into the competition process. And it highlighted many of the issues that Matthew's just been talking about, but a few others that sort of really talk about that we want homes to be adaptable, to be actually deal with the things that we need through different stages in our lives, that actually community environments actually create spaces where we can convene. I don't just mean community centres, but public space. So that survey is just another interesting, rich layer of insight into what, across the country, what people are looking for us as planners to be delivering as we both set policy for and give permission to and manage the detail that comes through in terms of development projects. And I just wanted to give colleagues on the phone and listening in a sort of heads up about where we're at within MHCLG. Everybody will have seen the white paper that was out in the summer. We were really hoping that people would engage with the white paper and actually start to think about what it would mean for them and and particularly aspects of the policy and how they would see them developing into the future. And well, people took us at our word, and we've had a fantastic response to the white paper, many very thoughtful presentations and responses. So thank you everyone on the call who has been involved in formulating ideas and responses to the white paper. We're now in the next stage of taking all of those thoughts forward, looking at them, and then going into sort of the more policy detail that comes out of the white paper. And many people are asking, well, what does this exactly mean? How is this exactly going to work? And what we're now doing is getting into that level of detail. So I can't give you very detailed prescriptive answers to what's going to happen next and exactly how design coding is going to work on the ground. But suffice to say, you know, we are very clear that the white paper has really strong intent behind it, and those intents are to have a planning system that is fleet of foot, that is uses time efficiently and effectively to both create plans and policy, but then actually to be able to take forward developments. But really importantly, that design quality is at the heart of the change that we want the planning system to enable and to deliver on the ground. And also, obviously, alongside that, sustainability and the route towards zero carbon by 2050. So big agendas for design quality within the reform work that we're doing. And again, just to really highlight to people, going back to the National Design Guide that was launched last year, and Andy von Bradsky, my colleague in the team, who's head of architecture, that is really a really strong policy context for all that we should be thinking about in terms of design quality and placemaking in our built and natural environments in our urban areas and in our towns and cities and villages. And I would just commend that to you again. It just records, you know, what we all collectively want to do in terms of placemaking, and it gives you that policy bedrock to draw upon as in practice, whether you're in the public or private sector. So I'd really just commend that document to you and just encourage you to look at it and turn over the pages of that guide. It's a great piece of work. And then what we've been working on in the last couple of months, and it's probably the most advanced piece of policy work that we've been doing in the reform space, is the National Model Design Code. And again, we're very happy to take questions on that. And that is starting to frame a method for how people can use design coding in the English planning system with all the kind of intricacies that we have and the uniqueness of place that we have in our different urban contexts. And what it really does is sort of demonstrate how we can think through design quality at different spatial scales, from the sort of settlement scale through to the major site scale, through to the design of streets and public space and the individual home. And that document is we're still sort of at the final stages of bringing that together, but it's going to be a really useful and powerful reference document for people to be using on the ground. Now, design coding by in many instances at the moment is used by the private sector when they're bringing forward a major scheme, and they've done a bespoke application, they've maybe done a hybrid application where there's aspects that are delivered in detail and other aspects that are going to come forward in further stages of consenting and permission. And so design coding is used to sort of give clarity of purpose to the master plan and then what's actually going to be delivered on the ground. And that's how we see design coding being used into the future, which is actually giving that clarity of purpose, potentially bringing more purpose into plans themselves, into development plans, but then informing development decisions through the consenting process. So that's one aspect of policy that we're working up at the moment. And I suppose I would just want to reflect on a few other aspects that I've learned through all my roles as a planner working across master planning, regeneration and lots of different projects. And it's this, that planners are absolutely the strongest and the most powerful when we're working really collaboratively and in a multidisciplinary way. And that we're seeing planning and placemaking and design are so interwoven in terms of how we think about the change that we bring about and the change that we enable. And I would just really encourage everyone to sort of think about planning in that way. We're the sort of glue that sits in the middle with landscape architecture, with engineering, with architecture, with other environmental disciplines. And I think it's a really exciting time where we've got a very strong policy drive for design quality coming from the Secretary of State and from the department. And we just really encourage colleagues across the industry to sort of think holistically about design. And no more than ever has it been important in terms of environmental design and environmental performance almost of our built and our natural environment. And again, we need to sort of be really wide-ranging in terms of how we think about design. And I don't think of it down at the level purely of the architecture of a house or the architecture of a building. Design actually happens, and when we spatially plan a town or a city and we're looking at where to allocate land, then we're making decisions, we're making spatial planning decisions, and in that moment we should be looking at the environmental performance of places, the environmental landscape, the environmental assets, how public transport relates to sites and development, and thinking about how we bring all of those things together in what is in effect a sort of design exercise, and then how that feeds into how you look at major sites or small sites, and we set the parameters for design and development that will come forward. Now, everyone has been doing much of that already across the country. We are so clear that design has been at the heart of how people have been using the planning system for a large number of years, and we're in a really strong place. So what we're doing in the reform work is just making sure that we're being really fleet of foot in how design feeds into both development planning and in terms of the consenting regime, and bringing that really to the fore in terms of how we're thinking about the planning system. So I'm going to leave it there. Wishing you a very good day and a very good conference, fantastic speakers, and thanks to colleagues who'll be joining the Q&A in a little while. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was a good, helpful overview of the situation as it is now, and apologies to everyone for our more limited technology there, although that is a very nice picture that our colleagues at the RTPI arranged. So next up is Dr. Victoria Thomson from Historic England. This is partly about capturing the fact that, as well as the Urban Design Network, we also have a historic environment group. And there's a huge amount of overlap clearly between the worlds of heritage and design, whether that be in job roles or in practical application on the ground. Victoria is near enough the most senior planner in the entire country in terms of heritage, so we're very lucky to have her here today. So Victoria has over 20 years experience in planning policy and conservation work, primarily in local government, but including some roles in central government and academia. She's currently the head of national strategy at Historic England and formerly the head of planning there. She's a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute and the IHBC. And although she didn't write it in her little CV, I would say so. The websites that her team delivers have some really useful information. There's a very good Twitter account for regular updates and a very good bulletin on the state of play with relation to heritage policy, which is industry leading. So I think there'll be a link to that in the presentation. So Victoria, if you would like to talk.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for that introduction. And can I just check that you can hear me okay and see the presentation?
Yes, and yes.
That's a good start. Thank you then. So I'd like to start by addressing the fact that there's a heritage item on the programme for a design event. Some may think that this is something of an anomaly, but I'm delighted to see it there and to be here to discuss heritage, because Historic England's very firmly of the view that design and heritage are closely linked, indeed inextricably so. Heritage and design most obviously come together in place shaping, which we see as a key part of our role. One of our aims is to protect, champion and save the places that define who we are and where we have come from as a nation. And this role was recently confirmed by our Secretary of State in Historic England's tailored review report. Shown here is our publication, Heritage, the Foundation for Success, which illustrates a number of ways in which great places are shown to have heritage at their core. As the document states at the outset, today's great placemakers are achieving this by incorporating surviving historic buildings into new schemes, by reflecting historic street patterns, and through the faithful use of traditional materials and exquisite architectural features. The most successful places embrace all these. Celebrating and reinforcing what's most successful and distinctive about a place requires that the place is first understood and its importance and relevance appreciated. Much of what's distinctive and special will stem from the historic environment, whether that's the designated elements, such as a listed town hall, or the everyday, which you see in the fine grain of a place, such as street patterns and materials. You can learn more about the designated elements by looking at the entries for listed buildings, scheduled monuments, registered parks and gardens, and so on the National Heritage List for England. but there are also historic environment tools for better understanding that wider context, such as conservation area appraisals and historic area assessments. And our advice on both of those is shown here. Historic area assessments may be a little less familiar. They give insights into how and why a place has come to look the way it does, identifying the range of landscapes and building types, their dates and forms, and relating them to the wider evolution of the area. They're just one part of a much wider suite of approaches to assessing the character of historic places at different geographical scales, and further information is available on our website for those keen to investigate further. Now, we do still occasionally hear suggestions that the historic environment is a constraint and gets in the way of new development. There isn't time today to explore all our evidence in this area, notably heritage-led regeneration and the inherent sustainability in pursuing the reuse of historic structures rather than new build, nor the degree to which heritage is not an obstacle to positive and swift planning decisions, often resulting in higher residential densities. So I'd certainly recommend you to have a look at the publications shown here, where there is a lot of evidence for your entertainment and delight. What I will say now is that we see heritage as an opportunity. At worst, it can provide design cues, but at best, it can be a real inspiration and a leaping off point for successful new designs. I'd also just add that conservation is defined in the MPPF as the process of maintaining and managing change to a heritage asset in a way that sustains and, where appropriate, enhances its significance. There needs to be protection, of course, but there's a lot of dynamism in and around the historic environment. Place shaping, though, is as much about communities as it is about the environment. And again, the historic environment field has something to offer. Discussions around significance, the term used in national planning policy to describe what's important to a place and is to be conserved, are excellent opportunities to get communities actively involved. And local designations, such as conservation areas and non-designated heritage assets, which you might recognise more easily as locally listed buildings and gardens and so on, all present opportunities to get communities exploring their environments, learning about them, and seeing how their local areas have changed in the past and can successfully change again. Place shaping and design are very active areas for us at the moment. Our existing places strategy, shown here, is to be reviewed next year, and some other pieces of work are already actively underway. Firstly, design codes and the historic environment. This project is being led for us by Node. The project aims to develop understanding of how the historic environment has been reflected in design codes, drawing conclusions from examples of both good and bad practice. It also aims to develop approaches to aid the creation of design codes with particular reference to enhancing their consideration of the historic environment. For instance, which aspects of the historic environment should be considered in design codes for new places to reinforce local identity and distinctiveness. Second piece of work we've commissioned Purcell to deliver, and it's on design and the historic environment. Its focus is on how best Historic England can refresh and refocus its existing design and place shaping offer, and ensure that the character and significance of the historic environment is properly referenced in all relevant planning decisions. The work is going to support a number of actions, including updating and adapting our design-related web content, considering the need for an online toolkit to promote improved design standards in the historic environment, establishing a searchable database of all design-related case studies, updating and extending our design training within existing programs, and ensuring that our design work is widely available. And this work is due for publication relatively soon, so something to watch out for. I've also been asked to talk today about the current state of play with regard to heritage generally and heritage and design more specifically. Given how much has happened recently, this can necessarily only be a sample of heritage-related matters. The hierarchy of legislation, policy, guidance and advice is as good a structure as any under which to do that, starting with legislation. So there have been a number of changes to planning legislation in recent months. You may or may not have spotted that Section 19 of the Business and Planning Act 2020 enables the extension of listed building consents, where the works to which the consent relates must otherwise be begun between 23rd of March and 31st of December of this year. The works are now required to start no later than the 1st of May of next year. So it's just a helpful thing in light of current circumstances. There have also been a number of provisions in relation to upwards extensions. Firstly, the right to extend purpose-built blocks of flats upwards by 2 additional stories with controls regarding existing height and ultimate total height, and the right to construct 1 or 2 additional stories in the form of flats on top of defined buildings, again with certain controls. Prior approval is needed in both cases, and the local planning authority must consider various matters, including impact on amenity and the external appearance of the building. Rights don't apply to buildings in conservation areas or to listed buildings. But there are also further permitted development rights relating to the enlargement of dwelling house with caveats of up to 2 additional stories. Obviously, we're expecting further new planning legislation, slightly broader in scope than the points just raised, as outlined in the planning white paper, which brings us neatly to policy. So you'll certainly have noticed the issue of the planning white paper in August and almost certainly have responded to the consultation. Looking first at the heritage-specific proposals in the white paper, we very much welcome the recognition of the value of heritage and of heritage protections within the policy document. Our view, which is supported by research, is that current policy works very well when it's properly applied. Much of our activity is directed to supporting that proper application. So the recognition of the value of existing policy, as I say, is welcome. We are, unsurprisingly, keen to see greater reference to the full extent and value of the historic environment as the detail of the proposals is worked up. And we're also keen to work with MHCLG colleagues on the exploration of new and better ways for securing consent for routine works, listed buildings, including the suggestion that suitably experienced architectural specialists may earn autonomy from routine listed building consents. Joanna's already set out the government's design agenda, but I'd just like to highlight our general support for the prominence of design as an issue in the white paper and our strong interest in the design-related proposals. Again, we're keen to offer our support, including our emerging research findings, in working up the detail here. Moving on to guidance then. Planning practice guidance was significantly updated in July 2019 to reflect the changes made in both 2018 and 2019 to national planning policy. This was a while ago now, but there's still a few changes in the historic environment section which are worth pointing out, as you may not have seen them at the time. Firstly, clarity is now provided regarding the definition of heritage assets. They're now clearly classified as either designated or non-designated, which provides greater certainty as to which part of the MPPF policy is to be applied. There's also clarity as to how they're identified. The ways in which non-designated heritage assets can be identified now specifically include neighbourhood plans and neighbourhood planning bodies. There's also greater discussion of the nature of harm, including clarity regarding total loss and how harm should be articulated, and there's more information on assessing potential harm to conservation areas. There's also additional text on the assessment by applicants of significance and the impact of proposals on that significance, and there's the reinstatement of the 4 interests, the definitions thereof, which was originally set out in PPS 5 back in the day. With regard to optimum viable use, there's now clarification of the where appropriate provision in the NPPF, and there's also clarity regarding the status of World Heritage Site buffer zones as part of setting and the related consultation requirements. I won't go into the detail of all of these now, but there is a briefing on this on our website should you wish to explore it further. Staying within the field of guidance, the National Design Guide was issued in October 2019, and reverting to my earlier theme, I'd just like to flag its recognition of the strong links between design and heritage. In articulating the 10 characteristics of a well-designed place, the National Design Guide repeatedly invokes heritage and the historic environment, particularly in relation to context, where there's reference to both understanding and relating well to the site in its context, and valuing heritage, local history and culture, but also in relation to identity, where there's reference to responding to existing local character and identity. Moving on to advice, Historic England produces 2 series of planning advice to support the successful implementation of government legislation, policy and guidance. First amongst these is Good Practice Advice Notes, or GPAs, and these address issues which are important in good decision making affecting heritage assets. Whilst GPAs 1 and 2 on local plans and decision making, and GPA 4 on enabling development are all very useful in general terms, GPA 3 on setting is probably most relevant to today's discussion. And here I'd just highlight that the MPPF confirms that significance derives not only from a heritage asset's physical presence, but also from its setting, which is often overlooked in practice. Our Historic England Advice Notes, the second of our published series, or we call them HENS, cover various planning topics in more detail and at a more practical level. They too are subject to public consultation and, like the GPAs, are often referred to in the planning practice guidance and in planning inspectorate decisions. We try to produce advice in response to particular issues that we or others identify. And within this growing series, it's quite a lot listed here, a few are worth highlighting as being of particular relevance to today's topic. HEN 4 on tall buildings has obvious relevance. This is currently being updated and the revised version will be published next year. We've also commissioned some work on assessing the impact of tall buildings on the historic environment, which we hope to publish in the spring. This will inform our understanding of how the predicted impact of tall buildings on the historic environment compares with the reality of the impact of those buildings post-construction, and seems to be set to be a very, very useful and interesting document indeed. HEN 7 on local heritage listing is also being revised, and consultation on the draft closes on the 18th of this month. That will be finalised probably next month. And other HENs in the pipeline which you may be interested in include HENs on listed building consent, the draft of which is currently out to consultation until the 21st of December, commercial renewable energy, farm and public benefit, planning and archaeology, permission and principle, and fittingly for today's discussion, heritage and design. So, as illustrated in a small way by our planning advice pipeline, the planning world is always rather active, but is particularly so at the moment. And to help you stay on top of developments in the world of heritage planning, and as hinted at by Justin earlier, I have some recommendations for you with links to our website where appropriate. Firstly, we publish all of our responses to government consultation, so you can see our thinking on a wide range of topics. Whenever legislation, policy or guidance changes significantly, we produce briefings or presentations to highlight the key points, which may also be of use. But for regular updates, have a look at our monthly planning bulletin, which highlights some of the recent and forthcoming developments in the world of planning from a heritage perspective. This also flags our forthcoming and recently issued advice, our training opportunities, and any relevant research that we've produced. For more immediate updates and breaking news, follow us on Twitter. The Heritage Advice account has more technical content than the main Historic England Twitter account. And you'll also see updates on casework, advice, training, and much more. And of course, all our research, advice, and so on is on the Historic England website, along with contact details if you have any queries or indeed suggestions for further published advice that you find useful. We do what we can to assist, so do contact us with any queries or requests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Right, we've now got time for a Q&A session. So can Matthew turn your camera back on and mic back on for this? We have got Joanna has had to go off and do chief plannery things, but we have a super sub, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer star. We have Andy von Bradsky, head of architecture at the MHCLG. I'm not sure if he's going to have a video enabled way of interfacing with us, or whether we're just going to have his voice, or possibly neither. But in any case, while that's sort of possibly getting sorted out, if we start with a more heritagey question and then cut across to others, there was a few questions coming in on the interface between design codes and heritage. So have you got any sort of views on that, Victoria, that the role, opportunities or not of design codes in relation to those sort of more historically rich urban environments?
Well, we'll have a lot more to say on this subject when our research is published shortly, but in the meantime, I think there's a direct and very important link between heritage and design codes, which we're very, very keen to see explored. I think design codes are all about understanding what's there and making sure that new development is as good as it can be, and that's absolutely how we approach the historic environment and managing change to it. So very much natural bedfellows. I think one of our key concerns in developing the field of heritage within design codes is making sure that design codes are produced at the appropriate scale, or at least recognise differences in character and local distinctiveness at different scales. Our view is very much that a district-wide design code is probably not going to pick up all the nuances that really ensure that local identity and distinctiveness is properly reflected and appreciated. So yes, absolutely related topics, very much both to be considered together, but at the appropriate geographical scales.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew, do you want to pick up a bit on that? Because you've been doing some good presentations and sort of reports recently on similar sort of themes of it needs to be posited at the right sort of level.
No, I absolutely agree with Victoria. I think the value of a code at the sort of level of a whole district, or, a whole borough, is, well, it has value, but it's much more limited, the value, because ultimately, even the most homogenous place, most homogenous borough is going to have a lot of diversity within it, not least the historic areas. And I think you find that, you go into many historic areas and they already have a code, and it's about recognizing what that code is and working with that code rather than necessarily trying to impose a new code on it. But that may be entirely different in a greenfield situation where you can impose something which is much more, much more radical perhaps, or just different. Yeah, it's about recognizing the existing codes and doing it at the level of the site.
Yes. Andy, are you there? If so, do you want to comment a bit on where you are currently with design codes? I think we can take that as a no. Oh no, there we are. Andy, we can see you, but we can't hear you at the moment. Are you on mute? Okay, right, we can't hear Andy. So hopefully his voice will kick in a minute, but so as not to waste time. Another one of the things that's sort of come up through the questions a bit is that perennial issue of capacity. We can all remember reports which were produced decades ago talking about impending challenges with capacity within the sector in terms of urban design, landscape architecture, heritage skills, etc. So obviously this does sort of bleed into some of the ideas of moving towards a more kind of plan-led system of planning, and who are these people that are going to be able to do all the design codes and or underlying design skills within the planning sector more generally with existing conventional work streams. So sort of any comments from any of you on that one?
Firstly, can you hear me now?
We can.
Ah, brilliant.
In that case, let's just park that new question, which we'll come back to in a second. And Andy, if you want to comment a bit on where you are with design codes, I hope you heard the other two comments.
The first thing to say is real apologies from myself and Joanna about this. We'd had it all lined up, and it turns out that our government kit doesn't accept the software that's being used. So we've been scrabbling around. Thank you very much to those behind the scenes who've been sort of trying very hard to get this all up and running. Joanna's had to shoot off to another meeting, so she asked me to sit in on the Q&A. So I think the focus, I have to say I've been a bit distracted by all the exchanges, but my understanding is the discussion is largely about coding and where we sit with that. I think just to expand a little bit on what Joanna said by way of introduction and where we are with this, we've been working very closely with URBED, our consultant who's been supporting very much a joint thing between MHCLG and others in putting the coding work together. We had hoped that we'd be sharing this with you at this event because we're nearly concluding it, but we haven't quite sort of got it over the line yet with all the comments that are coming in. Just a sort of general point about what we're working on at the moment and how we've done it, which I think is really important to this particular conversation, is that we've been consulting very closely with industry, taking account of a lot of the feedback that we've been getting. I think the title National Model Design Code implied at one point some kind of simple thing that you could just impose on an area. regardless, and clearly that isn't the case. It hasn't been possible to do that in any event, never was sort of conceived as being a possibility. So really what we've come up with is much more to do with the process, backed up by lots of guidance notes. So how you go about coding is not predetermined entirely, it's flexible as well. So there'll be ways in which different circumstances will apply design coding in different ways according to their circumstances, whether it's a rural setting, whether it's a central urban setting, whether it's up against heritage and so on. So, you know, this is very much a process map as opposed to and a kit of parts. So local authorities can determine coding that's appropriate for their area. Just listening to Victoria, I'm afraid I didn't listen to all of it because of the toing and froing, but we very much respect, obviously, the importance of heritage assets and coding in respect of that. And we have worked very closely with Historic England in terms of getting the input that's necessary on the coding work. And in fact, we did the same for the National Design Guide. So very much reinforcing this point about character, you know, local character, creating character, building on local character, and not predetermining whether it should be vernacular or whether it should be an architectural style. It's how you build that new layer, I suppose, of design into a new setting. And in terms of Matthew's contribution, I just wanted to sort of say a few words about how we've been really listening to the wider sector and also other government departments. So the quality of streets, the use of manual for streets into the future, the quality of public space, the green infrastructure standards that are emerging from DEFRA now. We've been working very closely with those two departments, Department of Transport and DEFRA, to make sure that we're aligned with the latest guidance. And of course, the green infrastructure standards are very strong around access to open space. So I'm afraid I can't unveil this kit of parts, but I do think that you know, we're in the right place for addressing a lot of the issues that were raised earlier.
Thank you very much, Andy. Okay, shall we drift back to that sort of question on skills within the sector, long-standing issue, not going away. So Matthew, if you start with you maybe on that one.
Yeah, as you say, long-standing issue. Certainly our Place Alliance survey from 2017 showed that there was a real problem, design capacity within local authorities. And what we'd seen had happened over that previous 5 years up to 2017 was essentially that conservation officers across the country were being dumped on to become the sort of urban design officers as well. And you know, and that not only that will undermine their role on heritage, but also it's just not dealing with the situation. And now the government, as Andy's been saying, seems to be much more serious about design, which is really positive, I think. But it's going to require a long-term change in the capacity within local authorities, and that's not going to be something that can be delivered overnight. It's going to be a slow thing, but I think local authorities need to start planning for that now.
Victoria, presumably you would echo some of those comments, but
indeed, we have done some work for a number of years now with the IHBC and with Algeo regarding capacity on historic environment skills within particularly local planning authorities, and the figures aren't encouraging. There has been a massive reduction in heritage expertise in local government since 2006, but we're aware of that. And we do what we can to support the development of skills. We have a lot of training, most of it now, of course, online, but we're also very much looking forward to engaging with government and others in supporting skills development as outlined in the planning white paper. We think, again, the links between heritage and design mean that there's a lot we can pick up and coordinate, and hopefully between us we can provide the support that's very much needed. But I think I'll leave it to Andy to talk about the white paper commitments a little more.
Yes, I can do that. I mean, just on the resources issue, you'll be aware that we've set up this design body steering group, which is chaired at the moment by Nicholas Boys-Smith. And the purpose of that group is to determine the kind of gaps that might exist in local authorities in terms of skills, resources. How do we train them to use the new tools that we're developing, the design code? Specifically aimed around that at the moment. We are sort of subject to recommendations from that steering group. We have a secretariat that is supporting it, and it will be reporting in the spring on its recommendations for what that new design body should be. I mean, I think that's done in recognition of the fact that government acknowledges that local authorities need more skills, more resources, and if you have more of a rules base and you're expecting more input from local authorities in terms of determining, you know, the design policies for their area, the design standards for their area, then clearly they need different skills, they need new skills. And I used to work in a local authority when I left college. I went to work in a local authority to complete my studies, working in London and in a district council. And at that time, there was an architect's department. There was a chief architect working alongside a chief planner. And we've lost that. And you know, I think the statistics that Matthew's referring to is quite shocking, really. The shortage of skills in local authorities for design is quite something that we need to address. In some parts of the country, obviously a lot better. London seems to have more experience at this. Outside of London, it dissipates as you go out of the southeast. Some really good initiatives going on, public practice and the design network doing an awful lot of good stuff. But you know, we need to really ramp that up and have more of a sort of a support for local authorities. Ultimately, we want them to have their own skills and their own leadership rather than relying on external consultants. So the idea of each place having a chief design officer of some sort, whether it's a planner, whether it's an urban designer, whether it's an architect, whether it's a landscape architect, you know, there needs to be somebody who's overseeing their vision, the vision for their area. So government's recognised it. I suppose the issue is going to be, does the sector feel that the right amount of resources are going in to plug that gap? I can talk about the white paper if you want, Victoria. Happy to say a few words about that if you need.
Yes. Right. So we've had a few more questions coming in a similar vein, all around the dynamic between something that was picked up on partly in Victoria's presentation, with the extension of permitted development rights on the one hand, and then the aspirations for design quality and on the other, and the sort of somewhat awkward dynamic between the two. So yeah, well, sort of any comments on that from the panel? Matthew, obviously you've written a certain amount about this on recent blogs.
Well, I think there is a real tension there in government policy between, on the one hand, a sort of deregulatory sort of impulse, and the other a drive to improve design. And I think that tension is something which is not very easy to reconcile, I have to say. I mean, I think the sort of some of the standards we've seen in converted properties has been extremely worrying. And if you start to then project that onto, you know, building 2 stories on existing buildings and those sort of newer deregulatory measures, then I think it's extremely worrying what that might lead to in terms of the long-term impact on our built environment. And that just stands in so much contrast to other things in the white paper about, you know, the importance of design, the importance of the built environment, quality, and I think there's a real tension there, and I think the government at the moment doesn't show any sign of trying to resolve that tension, unfortunately. I think just coming back, by the way, to the issue of capacity, I think it was disappointing the Chancellor's recent statement. You know, the sort of lack of resources really going back into planning. I think if we're to be serious about design quality, then there needs to be a serious injection of funds into local authorities, and there's no sign of that at the moment. And you know, clearly we're in very difficult, challenging times. But you know, if we say one thing and don't seem to be delivering it, then I think that's problematic.
I suppose my nodding of head is not to be implied with any to any degree. I mean, on the permitted development rights, I mean, I think it was a symbolic and very significant move to introduce space standards into PDR, office to residential conversions. I think that came with a sort of recognition that alongside faster track or, you know, easier to develop solutions must come standards to some degree, and how this plays out into other things is to be seen, is to be watched, I guess, but not to underestimate or understate the importance of introducing space standards, which I think, you know, many had been lobbying for, and I'm sure Matthew would agree is a significant step forward for quality in permitted development rights.
Absolutely, yeah.
No, that's a very good point, and that is a recent positive development, certainly. Well, Victoria, you alluded to some of this sort of thing, and obviously your team's formal response on similar consultations before obviously expressed some concern, but do you want to add any more on that?
Just to say that there is undeniably a tension between permitted development right extension and design aspirations. There's also some encouraging sort of directions of travel in there in terms of the detail. If we look at upwards extensions, there's clearly an attempt to try and soften the impact or that tension, reduce that tension by requesting that certain issues get considered even though it's permitted development. So we see impact on amenity and appearance being picked up. So that shows an awareness and they're trying to soften a potentially negative impact. Obviously, we'd like to see heritage added to that list of matters to be considered because it's not at the moment within the PD rights. But then, of course, if you add so many steps and extra considerations, it does beg the question, what is the benefit of the permitted development right in the first place? It's starting to be possibly more complicated than the original normal planning application would have been. So there's another tension there with the wider reform agenda. So we offer our full support in trying to square the circle, but there are matters to be addressed still, I think, and we look forward to seeing how all that progresses.
Well, of course, this is why we have planning permission, isn't it? which is the best possible way. Victoria, you said at the start of your presentation, when it works well, it works really well, and so that's what we should be aspiring to, not trying to cut corners.
Yes. Well, let's segue off on something which sort of links to this. There's a couple of questions in on sort of move towards digitalization of planning, which clearly, if you take a step back, does have some benefits in terms of making the system more efficient and making those processes better. But equally, if you look at it with a design hat on, there is some risks from sort of, algorithm-based planning, obviously, potentially, and the kind of crowdsourced standard template type designs being kind of digitalized potentially leads to a more sort of homogeneous, generic style of design, whether that be house extensions or anything else. But also with some benefits for some of the sort of making the broader processes more efficient. So any thoughts on those sort of dynamics from the three of you?
I mean, I think that's one of the most exciting things of the planning reform package, is to bring us into an age of the digital solutions and a digital revolution, if you like. It seems to me that there's a big gap between what architects and designers have been doing for quite some years. When I was chair of PRP a long time ago now. You know, we were pretty advanced in digital, still are, you know, using digital platforms and so forth. But at the other end of the spectrum, you're still sticking notices on lampposts for the planning system. So how do you sort of bring, you know, those two extremes together into something that is workable? And the amount of data that is needed or is available or accessible could be easily sort of formulated into a, well, not easily, but, you know, requires resource, but can be sort of an easy win, if you like, if we put our minds to it. How we then sort of put together designs that help people to visualize places is another challenge. You know, how do we get coding in a way that people can actually see into the places that are being visualized and allow them to move around? That technology is there, View City. You know, how do we do that sort of thing more you know, in greater amounts? And then on consultation, we haven't talked about that much, but you know, there's a clear opportunity here to use digital platforms to get views, to convey information and so forth. And I know those are big challenges, but they're challenges that are well worth sort of pursuing, and you know, could lead to a much more interactive and iterative process in terms of plan making and in terms of design and how you bring those two things together. In terms of your worry about whether this will lead to sort of standardization, I think, you know, our architectural profession, our designers are able to work with systems and create the variety and create those local responsive solutions. So I don't see that as being necessarily a problem. I think one of the problems might be that there are tools on the market that sort of say, how do you get the best return from developing a site in this particular way with this kind of volume, which in themselves are okay as development tools, but they're not urban design tools. There is no automation to urban design. Urban design needs to be worked through by professionals. You know, design coding needs to be done by people who know what coding is all about. So just a few words from me.
Matthew or Victoria?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Andy says, it's a huge opportunity. As you know, new technology comes along, we have to embrace it and see what the opportunities are there. I mean, our housing design audit, which we published earlier on in the year, showed that the volume housing schemes that did best were those that had design codes. Why was that? Well, there's a very simple reason, that those involved architects or urban designers to create the design codes. So you need to have that design expertise as part of the process. The ones that didn't do so well were those which have, you know, the standard highway set of regulations plus the sort of standard product of the house builders imposed on a site without that creative design process. So you need that creative input to create great places. So, but as Andy said, you know, architects and urban designers are very used to working with technologies as they come along, and will use them to the benefit if they're allowed to do it.
Victoria, any comments, or do you want to?
I think it's worth also just talking briefly about the other element of digitization, which is making more information available digitally. And we're quite excited about all of that, especially with the front loading of the planning system as proposed in the white paper. So we're looking at the data we hold and how we can make that more readily available, but also the data that's going to be needed and what we can do in support of all of that, particularly on the archaeological side of things, for instance, making it as clear as possible what's out there and needs to be taken into account as early as possible in the process can only be a good thing.
Yes, no, that is definitely true. Right, okay, there's been a few questions coming in terms of the current planning system as opposed to possible future planning systems about the dynamic with PINs, Planning Inspectorate, vis-a-vis them supporting local authorities in terms of assessment on design or lack of, So sort of some comments on that. I know that Matthew's research on the housing design audit at the start of the year picked up on some of these sort of ideas as well. So Matthew, if you want to start maybe.
Yeah, well, certainly the housing audit did reflect a situation where some schemes seem to be being rejected at local authority level and then getting through on appeal. There wasn't a huge amount of evidence of that in the audit, but there was some evidence of that, and I think that's worrying. I don't know of any research that has systematically looked at the inspectorate and their approach to design, not recent research anyway. I don't know whether Andy knows of anything.
No, sorry. I mean, just from my point of view, alongside the codes will be changes to the MPPF, which will strengthen the application of the code. So that's a really important aspect. We have been talking to the planning inspectorate as we've been developing the code work. And at the end of the day, I suppose the planning inspectorate want to understand what is the balance of importance between these various different components that make up a decision. And certainly we've been giving them tools, if you like, with the National Design Guide and soon with the code, which will help them determine whether an application meets the quality criteria that is being proposed. This is all under the current system, not the new system. We haven't talked about that much yet, but that will be accompanying the release of the code work. At the end of the day, it's about a precedent and about decision making that can be pointed to other decisions having been made elsewhere, and that includes, of course, the government's own decision making around Secretary of State decisions. So, there's an opportunity with the tools that we're creating to have some case studies that we can refer to and say point to the inspectorate and say this is a case which you can use as a precedent. But that balance between quality and quantity is always going to be slightly there. But I would expect that once those tools are in place, developers, house builders will be thinking about the risks to them of a refusal on grounds of poor quality design.
Thank you for that. I'm aware that we've hit 10:51, so there's quite a few more good questions there, but we just don't have time for them. We'll try and look to capture some of those questions and use it for helping design some future events and that sort of thing. Right, so thank you very much to Andy for jumping in there and providing a lot of very helpful responses, and then Matthew and Victoria for the presentation and for doing the Q&A. We've got bones in minutes, so if people go off and make teas and coffees and stuff and imagine they're networking with people at a real conference, then we'll start again at 11 with Mike Leonard from the Building Alliance. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you in a bit.
Thank you.
Thank you. He just made an appearance on the you did.
Right, good morning again. We now have a series of additional talks picking up the nations with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and also two really important areas relating to the design dimension of planning. One more from the world of landscape architecture, and the next one more from the world of sort of building control and technical standards. So we're very lucky to have Mike Leonard speaking to us next, who is head of the Building Alliance based in the West Midlands. Mike is CEO of the Building Alliance and visiting professor at Birmingham City University, has extensive industrial experience, 40-year career managing acquisitions, disposals, mergers, global relocations, restructuring and turnarounds. A strong believer in the power of collaboration, he's built an extensive industry and academic network identifying and acting on common goals. He conceives and runs the Futures Group, which is the cross-industry influential new homes think tank, which advises government on better building regulations, and has built strong relationships with politicians, civil servants across Europe and in the devolved governments, combined authorities in Westminster. So we're going to pick up on quite a few of these really interesting and very important contemporary themes relating to kind of technical building performance and that interaction with the planning world. So Mike, If you're able to talk, that would be great. Thanks. Mike, you appear to be muted.
Hi, can you see my screen, Justin? Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, right, just give me 1 second. I have some building work going on in the background, and they promised me they'd stop at 11 o'clock, and they haven't. So just 1 second. Right, that's the technicalities of the building world. So I do apologise for that, but they absolutely promised that they'd stop at 11 o'clock. So. Right, okay, so thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about planning for a safer future. And so I want to talk a lot about the things that have happened in the built environment over the last few years, which have not all been positive. But I also want to talk about some general things as well, if I may take this opportunity. And I want to just address the question, because there's a lot talked, particularly in the housing world, about the number of houses that we're delivering and the fact that planning might be a barrier to that. And I just want to ask those questions really for consideration, perhaps in the question and answer procedure. But it's certainly my submission that planning has got a big part to play, and clearly we don't always take communities with us when we're considering planning applications. Therefore, local councillors and others feel duty bound to oppose planning applications, and as we've heard earlier, often those end up going to appeal. There's certainly an opportunity to turn that around, and some of the stuff we've heard around with digital and all those sorts of things can help us persuade the public and take the public with us. So I think that's incredibly important that we do that, and I'll come on to why as we go through. So around that agenda, because the agenda is certainly not one of under delivery because we don't build fast or all those sorts of things. It's about a lot about consent, and it's a lot about demand as well, and people wanting the right houses in the right places. So it's my submission that we should have no presumed consent, and we've heard a lot about that already this morning. But I think presumed consent is a get around which will upset and frustrate the planning system going forward, and only put the built environment in conflict with the rest of the community, which is something that I suggest we don't want. What of course we do need is to recruit and resource and train our planning departments. And again, this has been mentioned today, but you know, we can't expect to become proactive in the way that I think we should be if we don't have the right resources available to us within the local authorities. And yet we've seen constant cutting, constant shaving of resources, and a lack of proper recruitment and training and process to get people into planning. Probably because the planning system has, in my submission, become reactive. It's been process driven, and we've got away from the principles of planners doing the job that it says on the tin, of planning our communities and making things better places for people to live in. So I just leave those thoughts with you before I move on to my core presentation today, which is talking about building safety and futures. And of course, this all goes back to the tragic events of Grenfell, when so many people lost their lives and others had their lives blighted forever. This is a crushing indictment of all of us in the built environment. Now, what role you play, it happens on our watch, and it's still happening on our watch. If you listen to the public inquiry, and I'd commend to you all to go and listen to some of the podcasts that are freely available on BBC Sounds, you will hear some of the most disappointing, sad indictments of our sector. Right now, they're examining the materials industry, from which I've had a huge part of my career, And it disappoints me to hear of manufacturers who have clearly put sales ahead of safety. And we'd lot to come out of that public inquiry, but you know, there's some salutary lessons for everybody involved. These were picked up, of course, by Dame Judith Hackett with the Building a Safer Future review, and it's quite clear that that she, in her role now, has changed, but she's still involved in the process. Clearly frustrated that everybody seems to want to wait around for government legislation to change before making the positive changes. If I go back to that public inquiry, it's disappointing to me as well that people have been sought immunity from prosecution ahead of being willing to give proper evidence to an inquiry where so many people lost their lives. So the Building Safety Future review has brought out a number of things, including the introduction of a building safety regulator. That building safety regulator at this moment in time will only deal with buildings over 18 metres high, tall buildings. I hope and suspect that the government will respond to the consultation that's just been completed and reduce that to 11 metres. I can't, for the life of me, understand why a building is unsafe at 18 metres if you're caught in a fire, or 11 metres. It makes no difference. You can't leave that building safely if there's a catastrophic fire. So we need to think about reducing those to 11 metres and quickly. And again, it's disappointing that some professional bodies are trying to fight that, where I think it's indefensible, where life safety is a critical factor. Another outcome of the Hackett review and the Grenfell fire has been the introduction of the first stages of the fire safety bill and the building safety bill. Two very closely aligned pieces of legislation. The first dealing with properties that have been built and the operation of them and the inspection of those premises on a regular basis, calling for 1.6 million buildings to be inspected on a regular basis to ensure fire safety and ongoing fire safety. And the second, looking at the way in which we operate and build and construct our buildings. It's almost a return to the Clerk of Works, not quite, but it at least allows for a competent professional to be in charge of building safety throughout the process. So I think those pieces of legislation have got some way to go in terms of their legislative journey, but I think that they add real value in terms of making sure that things like Grenfell never happen again. If we look to the immediate and what's happening right now, it's another sad indictment that 3 years after Grenfell, we have people living up and down our country in properties that have cladding materials, not just the property materials that were used at Grenfell, but other combustible materials around their building, which have been deemed unsafe and need to be removed. Those people are living in fear. Those people cannot get mortgages. Those people cannot get access to insurance. And they can't sell their properties. And they're being asked for huge sums of money to take that cladding off and replace it, which are not accessible to them. So some real desperate things that you wouldn't expect to find in 2020, but unfortunately they are a live issue. In fairness to the government, they have now issued up their contribution to £1.6 billion to try and solve that problem, but it's estimated it could take up to 10 years to do. And that's manifested itself further in the EWS1 form, which is an RACS form, to assess the viability of buildings and to assess whether they are in fact safe in terms of fire at the point where products or buildings are being sold. And that in itself is causing some huge issues because of the lack of competency in the workforce to carry that out. So we don't have enough people with the competency to do that. And of course, the insurers, the PI insurance has gone through the roof because we're asking people to sign off on buildings to say that they're absolutely safe. The issue, of course, is that despite what might be on the outside of the building, all too often when we've taken off those cladding materials, we've found a lack of fire stopping and a lack of attention to detail, which again is a sad indictment of the sector. So I'm a firm advocate of testing. I think we should be testing our materials, testing our building systems. The 8414 test might not be perfect, but it's a very, very good benchmark of whether a system works in terms of protecting a building. And I think we should be doing more of that as we go forward. We should also, and we are, thinking about how we increase the competency by creating fire career pathways for people that want to go into fire safety and fire engineering. And I'm certainly working through Birmingham City University on a program to support that at this moment in time. A lot about design today, and so we should, because it's a planning conference. So I very clearly would say to you, in the context of fire, in the context of resilience, overheating in buildings, indoor air quality, and design and planning and creating better places and adaptable places, as we heard earlier on in the presentation, I cannot understand why the government is so committed to trying to drive us down the modular build and system route, which actually is at complete odds with both those things. And frankly, because it's made out of steel and timber and it's lightweight in its construction, it's very susceptible to fire. So I say no to modular build and systems as the presumed consent is offering up. And I also say no to the use of combustible materials, where in any place where there is a sleep risk, where there is a risk to life because people sleep or because vulnerable people visit those premises like schools and hospitals and the like. And that picture and that backdrop to that non-combustible materials slide there is of just one of the fires that happened in 2019. Barking, where the whole of the facade there goes up in flames. Worcester Park, where the buildings are reduced to nothing. Beechmore Care Home in Cheshire was completely destroyed by fire. I would leave you with these thoughts. Is that acceptable, given what we know in 2020 and more important in 21 and beyond? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Some very thought-provoking comments there, one way and the other. We can come back to some of these themes and the Q&A at the end of this session. So again, if you've got any questions you want to ask directly to Mike or to any of the speakers coming up, then please send them in via that tab. So the next speaker we've got is Heather Claridge, who is an urban planner, designer and geographer, currently seconded to Architecture Design Scotland. That's the computer making its nice noise. Previously with Glasgow City Council, where she helped support creative partnerships within Glasgow's Canal Corridor and co-led the internationally recognised temporary urbanism initiative Stalled Spaces, and developed green blue infrastructure and community-led lighting projects. She's a member of the Academy of Urbanism and co-chairs their Scottish Advisory Group. She's on the UN Habitat Planners for Climate Action thing. She is our Scotland design champion for the RTPI, was Young Planner of the Year, and unsurprisingly, given all that, is listed in the Planner's top 50 women of influence. So a very good person to listen to. Right, Heather.
Thanks, Justin, and hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I'm really delighted to be here this morning to give you some updates from what's happening in terms of planning and design in Scotland. And I think exploring the topic of what we need to know now. I think first to start off with, kind of as planners and designers, I think we really need to go back to thinking about what challenges we're trying to address through design. I think when we don't think about the challenges or the drivers for change, our place-specific and transformative impact of design is limited. So in Scotland, I've picked out 3 broad challenges, which I think will significantly shape how we plan and design places. And the first of these is ageing population. The number of people aged 75 and over is projected to increase by 85% over the next 25 years. And this ageing is happening at a faster rate in Scotland than the rest of the UK and is more prevalent in our towns and our rural areas. I think next up is loneliness and isolation, which I think Matthew touched on earlier. In this research, in this study, which was measuring the social connections in Scotland, it found that 1 in 5 adults in Scotland felt lonely some, most, or all the time. I think this is likened to being the equivalent of damage on your health to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and so it's really significant. This research was carried out in February 2020, so it was obviously before we had the impacts of COVID-19 and the restrictions that we face for that. So it's likely that that figure will have increased and become more acute. And I think the final point is about climate change. Already Scotland as a whole is 20% wetter than it was 50 years ago. I think the impact of increased water is having significant impact on our places. Much of our road and rail and infrastructure is already vulnerable, and when you project on the increases of climate change, we aren't ready for what's coming. But at the same time, we have ambitious targets in Scotland to be a net zero society by 2045. So I think when we couple all those together, when we think about how we need to design and what we need to design for, I think it's really clear that actually changing climate, changing population, and that changes to social capital that we need to make a really interesting, complex factors that we need to factor in. So guiding change in Scotland will be National Planning Framework 4, which is due to be published in 2021. This will set out a new plan for Scotland in 2050 and outline big decisions about our future development, infrastructure and land use. A position statement in the meantime has been published, which gives a bit of a flavour of the direction of travel for some of the emerging thinking that will go into National Planning Framework 4. And already much of the content has been informed by other organisations feeding in ideas and evidence, which was collected earlier this year and last year. The statement's really hot off the press. It was only published last Thursday. So I'm trying as a practitioner to digest what's in it, what this means for Scotland in terms of design and planning, and what that will mean in terms of how we evolve. But I wanted to share some emerging issues and ideas that were coming through in the position statement to just give you a flavour of that. So touching on the 4 themes, for considering net zero emissions, the statement highlights that we need a stronger preference for reusing existing buildings before new. For new developments, actively encouraging much wider use of sustainable and recycled material. It also means strengthening support for developments in town centres and enabling low carbon living through walking, cycling, wheeling and transport, public transport accessibility. For considering resilient communities, the statement highlights includes planning our homes together with everyday local infrastructure such as schools, community centres, local shops and healthcare, to significantly reduce the need to travel and ultimately supporting the 20-minute neighbourhood concept, which came through our programme for government really strongly. It also introduced for the first time an infrastructure-first approach to neighbourhood planning, which involves natural networks, sustainable travel, ensuring that access is fair for everybody. For considering a wellbeing economy, the statement highlights including stimulating new models of low carbon living in rural areas, as well as towns and cities, by facilitating further investment in digital infrastructure, building more space for people to work remotely, and creating community hubs. And finally, for considering better, greener places, the statement highlights include shifting future developments away from greenfield land by actively enabling the redevelopment of town centres and vacant and derelict land. So actually these emerging ideas in the position statement of reuse first, infrastructure-led developments, 20-minute neighbourhood concepts and town centre and brownfield renewal are clearly designed to help support the challenge around climate change, demographic change and greater social cohesion. I think what's fair to say that the ideas coming through are not necessarily new or novel concepts, but actually by embedding them in the national plan, hopefully it will help scale up efforts. And what I've done is I've selected a couple of examples of projects in Scotland, which I think are already epitomising some of those highlights. And I think they are good concepts or good practice that can be scaled up. So an example of reusing existing developments over building new developments is demonstrated in the Woodside Maltese project. Collective Architecture on behalf of Queen's Cross Housing Association designed the refurbishment of 3 blocks of flats originally built in the late 1960s. The refurbishment scheme is pioneering because it brings these landmark flats to the forefront of energy performance, designed to achieve passive standard for retrofit, including the enclosed balconies spaces which allow year-long round use. An example of town centre renewal is demonstrated in the new vision for Paisley, one of Scotland's largest towns. The vision proposes to transform the town centre by finding new uses for empty space based around local and community needs and introducing more town centre living, particularly that focused on ageing population. And finally, an example of low carbon infrastructure-led development can be found in the first phase of the Counterswell development in Aberdeen. This is a new neighbourhood of social housing, mid-market rent and owner-occupier, which has been designed to incorporate and connect different systems together, including water, habitat, and active travel and digital networks throughout. Walking is the main mode of movement around the development, and it's the first location in Scotland to have access to hyperfast broadband. And the scheme recently won the Green Infrastructure Development of the Year in the Scottish Homes category. I think my own organisation has already been doing some research on some of the aspects highlighted in National Planning Framework. So we've been thinking about how do you design for a changing climate and think about that whole place approach to that net zero carbon challenge. And we've also been doing some work around town centre living and how that can support how we design places to support more independent living for our ageing population. So I'm just going to end on some final thoughts around design now and what we need to know. From a Scottish perspective, to fully address the emerging challenges of population, climatic and social changes, and harness the opportunities emerging in National Planning Framework 4 position statement, I think we need a shift in our mindset, approach and knowledge base. Firstly, we need a mindset that embraces a reuse first approach, be it land, buildings or infrastructure. We need to design greater localism with local people and for the public interest. And we need to be the ultimate collaborators. And I think that came through what Joanna was saying. And I think the collaboration means also working with a diverse range of people. Next, our approach needs to support a whole place focus that enables collective impact. Yes, public sector leadership will need to be driven by the public sector, that actually we need to work with all sectors to maximise preventative spend. And we need to do this at pace, and we need to scale up good practice like the examples that I've shown. And finally, we need to improve our own individual and collective knowledge about aspects such as nature-based solutions, circular economy principles, sustainable design of materials, and improving our carbon literacy. So whilst 2020, it feels like it may have exposed quite a lot of problems of place and societal problems in Scotland, I think it's really reinforced the worthwhile nature of the role of planning and design to address these. And 2021 and beyond looks set to be an important and exciting year for planning in Scotland. So I'm really excited about being a planner, thinking about how I am at the forefront of place, climate and health action. So thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to find out any more about the work that we've done, please visit our website, and here's our details.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was a very useful, interesting talk, and as mentioned, it kind of carried on effortlessly from Joanna's initial talk, and actually leads very nicely into Dave Singleton's talk, which is to follow, which is picking up on a lot more of these themes of the health dimension of planning, interdisciplinary working, partnership working, and the environmental dynamic of sustainable development through planning, which is so important. So next we have Dave Singleton from DSA Environment and Design Consultancy, and also past regional chair of the Landscape Institute and involved with them. Dave has long been fascinated with the outdoors. Originally a geographer, he worked as an outdoor pursuits instructor in the US before studying landscape architecture at Sheffield University. His professional experience covers a wide range of landscape and urban design practice, from planning to detailed design. David has contributed to the CIRIA SUDS Design Manual and is a judge for their National SUDS Award Scheme. As well as running his consultancy, he teaches civil engineers urban design at Nottingham-Trent University and is a member of the Design Midlands Design Review Panel, and also contributes to a number of Landscape Institute and other organisations, CPD type events, particularly in the East Midlands, which is where he is based. So, Dave, hopefully you're going to turn your camera on and start your presentation imminently, or not.
Have you got me, Justin?
And I can hear you. Perfect.
Can you see my screen?
We could, and now we can again.
Fantastic. Is that the presentation? That presentation ready to go?
It is now.
Fabulous. Thank you. I shall start, shall I?
Yes, please.
Thanks very much, Justin, for inviting me and sharing some thoughts on planning, design of places, and health, of course. So I'm going to give a very rapid introduction to building for a healthy life, with some tips on, all being well, if this works, what you might do to apply some of these in your daily life as planners. Now, we tend to think that change is gradual, but the philosopher Nassim Taleb argues that change is really caused by sudden expected events, or black swans. And excuse me, this isn't working. There we go. It looks like health is top of the agenda now, and the idea of places that are healthy has similar importance. Now, I'm one of the 5 authors of Building for a Healthy Life, and I've worked in master planning and design review for almost 30 years now. And I think, like Heather, the start point to all this is for us to consider why we're interested in design and planning. in England, at least, it's the MPPF, and it's got a whole section on achieving well-designed places. And design, as you can see here, is everywhere in that. And the MPPF talks, amongst other things, about effective engagement with all parties. And we've heard earlier about how planners working collaboratively are more effective. I think we all are. So the MPPF in para 129 explores how this might be done and suggests that tools like Building for Life 12 are a good way of doing this. The Environment Agency, Sir James Bevan, says that building a healthy environment is just about the smartest thing that we can do. And Building for Life has been updated now into Building for a Healthy Life. And this, of course, isn't just about encouraging people to move around. It's not just about encouraging physical health, which we need to do, arguably, but also mental health. And we've designed the Building for a Healthy Life tool to enable everyone to use it, including local communities and as well as professionals. And this is why the document's got lots of pictures in it to explain what we mean. Essentially, it is about encouraging walking, cycling, movement, but also social interaction and play. And it's particularly related, obviously, to housing schemes. Now, you can use Building for a Healthy Life as a tick box tool, and we know this is done. And that's fine. That's fine. But it's not really intended centrally to be used as a scoring mechanism. It's supposed to be to stimulate discussions about what healthy places might be, about what healthy design might be. And this is because we firmly believe that design isn't a product. It's not the result, it's a process. And it's a process of creative decision making. It's like the recipe, not the cake. So Building for a Healthy Life is intended to be used as a guide. And there are 12 considerations. In this respect, it's like Building for Life 12, obviously, hence the name. 3 parts, 4 considerations in each part. So it's divided down, starting with the macro scale, with integrated neighbourhoods, then talking about distinctive places and 4 things that might contribute to that. And finally, looking at streets. And we've heard about the importance of streets earlier. For each consideration, you should think about whether to go ahead in that process or maybe stop and rethink using a traffic light system, or we've illustrated this using a traffic light system. So red for stop, green for go. So I'd like to take 3 considerations that particularly interest me from a landscape architectural point of view. I'd stress that I don't speak for the Landscape Institute. I am a landscape architect. Firstly, natural connections. This is really at the heart of Building for a Healthy Life, or BHL, because we don't want to prevent people inadvertently from walking. Making natural connections across a development site right from the start is a key part of this. Distinctive places, we'd hope, would be inherently easy to find your way around and would encourage exploration on foot by everyone, not just adults and able people, but everyone. And this really does involve considering the character of the street to help everyone form a mental map of where they are. Thirdly, something that's especially dear to my heart, green and blue infrastructure, or blue and green infrastructure, if you prefer. We sometimes refer to this as BGI. Back to Sir James Bevan. Notice that he's talking here about good quality green space, not just green space. And we feel that's particularly important. And this is the difference between POS, if you like, just some public open space, and blue-green infrastructure. Infrastructure is there to do something. It's got a defined function, ideally lots of defined functions. So on the left-hand side here, you can see an attenuation basin, I hope, and it's open. It's on a volume house builder site. This is a Bellway site, and it invites play. On the right, something that's reasonably typical in British housing design, perhaps a space that doesn't invite exploration quite so much. We'd regard this, I think, as a lost opportunity, as well as a potential maintenance liability and other things. So now some tips on, I know you've been waiting for this, on what people might find helpful. I hope so. First of all, the site. Start with the site, not a detailed layout or even options of a layout. It's very important to get out there, if necessary, get out in the rain and get wet and understand what the site offers, what it's like, what kind of place it is. We've heard this several times this morning from various speakers. We know it's very difficult not to rush, but take your time. There's always pressure to arrive at a solution. We, though, when we're doing design review and I'm advising local authorities, find that spending time to thoroughly consider the problem, as Heather was talking about first, pays off. And this can really speed the process up. Get it right from the start. Agreeing the constraints and opportunities early helps to make a very strong case for your proposals. Constraints and opportunities are sometimes two sides of the same thing and might include all sorts of things: levels, water, vegetation, access points, movement networks, views, and neighbouring uses. Sometimes we see that the applicant says the opportunity is to deliver houses, but surely there's more to placemaking than that. Maps. Internet resources mean that aerial maps, aerial views, LiDAR, historic maps, and other maps and resources are readily available. These, of course, show the context to a development proposal, not just the content, and are therefore really important to have in your base information. And of course, we are looking as well at historic features, existing features, things that might be used to make a community, like the pub. So, other tips might include keywords. This is something that Sue McGlynn's particularly brought to my attention and the attention of other people. So there's a danger that we use words loosely without really explaining what this means or what the effects of calling things particular things might be. So what exactly is a buffer and why might it be needed? We see buffers separating housing from housing and housing from open countryside. Character areas. Character ought to be determined by the street because that's what people experience. And landscape corridors. Who really wants to experience a landscape corridor? Is it likely to become a cherished outdoor space? If we want parks, people have talked about the importance of big local parks, perhaps we should just call them that and make them parks. And they might be very different, I think people might agree, from simply landscape corridors. So I searched just to finish off for a picture to encapsulate the wonder of planning and of designing or creative problem solving. And I came up with this. So this little boy spends hours in the back near my house, planning, designing, even building. And it seems to me that as humans, this is something that we're impelled to do. So I hope this has been a useful introduction very, very quick introduction to building for a healthy life. And I hope, really hope, that it's stimulated some thoughts, and that now everyone is ready to design.
Thank you very much, Dave. Excellent as ever. Lots of useful points there at the kind of more basic rudimentary level about thinking about design, but also some bigger thematic things to think about there as well. So very helpful. Coming up next, we drift across to Northern Ireland, where we have Mura Quigley speaking for us. Mura is a chartered planning and urban designer for urban scale interventions, a people-centered design studio based in Northern Ireland. She's delivered streetscape policy and projects for Transport for London, as well as strategic sustainable urban extensions, regeneration strategies and master plans across the UK. Before joining that organisation, she lectured in spatial planning and design at Ulster University and is currently completing her doctoral research into adaptive planning and design in the UK. She's currently the RTPI's Urban Design Champion for Northern Ireland and is a member of the Northern Irish Executive Strategic Design Group, amongst other things, and gave a very good talk at the recent Young Planners Conference as well. So Mura, are you there? Can you turn your camera on? Or if not, can we hear you?
Can you all hear me okay anyway?
Yeah, can hear you.
Brilliant. And you should be able to see me now on my screen. Is that right?
Perfect.
Brilliant. That's great. Thanks, Justin, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here to speak to you today. We are a little bit of an unusual little corner of the UK here in Northern Ireland, but we're an interesting one too. And we've been going through quite a lot of change recently in terms of planning and design that I can update you on today. I can see from the presentations that have come before as well that there's not dissimilar issues. There's probably just different ways at which we come about tackling them based on our unique political situation. But for us, what's actually quite nice is that there's sometimes a bit of a lag in our design thinking or progress in design thinking. And actually that can work in our favour as we use the learning from other places to inform what might work well here and tried and tested methods as well. So I'll take you through how we're getting on with our planning reform at the moment, a little bit about our design governance, 4 themes or priorities that I think design is starting to focus on and can make a real contribution onto here in Northern Ireland, and just some of the key challenges that we're going through and trying to tackle that. So what's been happening? Quite a lot in the last 5 years. And in fact, this has all been leading up from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement that ended the conflict here in Northern Ireland and set up our power sharing executive. So, but to go back in 2015, especially was a big year because we overhauled our local government system. We reduced our local councils from 26 very small councils down to 11, more strategic. For the first time since 1972, planning functions were transferred to councils. So all planning sat within central government until that point. And this was a process of normalisation coming out of the Good Friday Agreement. So it was really about this review of public administration, a whole root and branch review. And so one of the big changes was this new 2-tiered planning system, but also new functions and new powers for our local councils. So a very front-loaded planning system with greater community engagement and design early on in the process. Councils now having a statutory authority, being the statutory planning authority for the majority of planning applications. New power of community planning, and we've learned from other parts of the UK in terms of that, but really for us it's about joined up service provision and working and collaborative working and more joined up thinking for better service delivery for communities. And in 2014 we published our strategic planning policy statement that really embeds these 5 core planning principles that speak to the direction of travel and where the priorities are for the region. So you start to understand what the priorities are when you see those. And Firstly, there's been a big push to recognise the need to embed healthy urban planning into what we do. Also importantly is about reconnecting places, breaking down the physical and territorial barriers, and creating greater community cohesion and better service provision ultimately. In Northern Ireland, our economy is still recovering from decades of poor investment, and there's a real drive to encourage longer term thinking about economic sustainability, and design has a big role to play in that. Good design and positive placemaking, great to make it into its five core planning principles. So it is being championed centrally, but now the task and the power is with local councils to make that happen. So how that is delivered on the ground is really important. And then also placing a real importance on place and heritage and identity as part of the new place shaping role for councils. So our biggest role is in demonstrating the value of planning and design and how it's at the core of a sustainable development agenda, especially for those who traditionally didn't have an awareness of the power of good design and planning. And collaboration and cross-working, which I've heard a lot about already this morning, is really important here because of the way our government is set up, but also it's very crucial in terms of the delivery of projects and good design. So just a bit about our design governance in Northern Ireland, and I go back to George in 1997, who said that, you know, urban design is like a second order design endeavour. You rarely have full control over the final product of your work, but more so you are concerned with the designing of the decision-making environment and getting that right and configuring that right, so that the places that we developed can be delivered well. Due to our complex politics, this really resonates with the urban design task here in Northern Ireland and in a lot of the work that I've been involved in. And I think it's really important that we get that right and get that decision making right through good policy, good programmes and good regulation. And part of that is bringing all our political parties with us as we share power and built environment functions. And as Heather rightly pointed out, bringing the private sector along with us is one of our most challenging tasks at the moment, but we're really trying to push ahead with that. So in terms of some of the design tools that we have here, we have a ministerial advisory group for architecture and the built environment, and they sit close with government and advise them on good design and delivering a design review service. But that is quite limited, and that is being diversified through local governments. Some of our local councils don't make use of the service and don't really sort of embrace that design championing agenda for the MAG. So that's a big challenge that we have to overcome. We have very limited use of design codes and design frameworks, so it's great to sit here and hear from you all today, and we can learn a lot from that as our local governments start to embed good design. Our local councils still don't have any regeneration powers, housing, streets or health within their remit yet, and it was something that was to come as part of the review of public administration, but that process of normalisation is obviously very complex and political, and so it's very challenging working across different government departments to deliver good planning and regeneration and housing. We do have two very decent and good national design guides. The first, Creating Places, now is a bit dated, but is a practical and good practical and technical advice to supplement residential development. And in 2014, we published Living Places, and that for the first time introduced this concept of stewardship into urban design, really embedding good community ownership and building places that last and are enduring. But we're still waiting for a full suite of development plans to come through. In fact, none of the new development plans for the 11 councils have been adopted. So we have a huge plan and policy gap at the moment. And just to give you a flavour for what that means, the current development plan for my hometown and for that area is older than I am. And I'm not going to tell you what age I am, but I'm sure you can guess that is quite old. So going back to Living Places, really powerful urban design and stewardship guidance that came through in 2014. And it took a significant collaborative effort to be developed and highlights these 10 qualities of good, successful places. Yeah, it's really important that that aspect of stewardship and ownership and buy-in is achieved. And I think we're at the stage of kind of now getting living places out there and trying to demonstrate where it has worked well and where those places that can really inspire us and we can learn from are being delivered out there. But I think there's still a bit of a kind of a lack of focus on design here. And the MAG, two key MAG members themselves said recently in a paper, and I think this sums up the whole attitude to design here at times. And, you know, whilst there is a level of belief in the value of good design and in design review, this conviction is not as widely shared in Northern Ireland as other parts of the UK. So ultimately, this is reflected in a less established and less committed design review process, but I would extend that out to be about the whole design community in general and planning and design. So I just want to run through a couple of priorities or opportunities for us here to help drive forward that design-led agenda and embedding good design into our kind of core societal and governance processes. I'm going backwards instead of forwards. And the first aspect is what I mentioned previously about a community planning agenda. So there is a real big focus on outcomes and delivering for communities here. We're the first place in the UK to have this statutory link between our community plans and our local development plans. However, they are very high level because they're at a district level. So we're still waiting for these kind of local area specific plans to emerge and come forward. And obviously still waiting for our LDPs to come through as well. It's required us to look at how community priorities manifest themselves spatially in the local development. And we look forward to seeing how these come forward as part of that. The next big theme, and it's been touched on already, is about designing for climate resilience. And there's been a huge focus here on tackling climate change. And I'm glad to say that it has become a shared political priority finally. But we're starting to see resilience strategies and climate action plans coming forward at local government level. But you can see here the scale of our task. Here in Northern Ireland, we have a pretty poor record in terms of carbon emission reductions. Based on our 1990 levels. And the big contributor to that is transport, which has gone up significantly in the last number of years. So they continue to rise. And this is due to how spread out our population is and the historic lack of investment in public transport. There is a will to change, and the pandemic has focused and shifted our attention towards this, but there's a huge amount of work to do in understanding how much planning and design can contribute towards this goal, and also build resilience to be able to function, for places to be able to function and adapt to some of the climate challenges that are coming forward as well. Another key theme that is starting to emerge and be built on quite strongly here in Northern Ireland is well-being, and we are drawing a lot of influence from other parts of the UK as well. I think that's one advantage of our community planning system, is this focus back to public health in our urban environments. So a lot of our work is now being, I mean, me personally within urban scale interventions, we have the Public Health Agency as one of our major clients in our work. And I think they're beginning to really recognise the power of the environment in promoting a prevention agenda for health rather than always focusing on a preventative approach or a reactive approach. We have notoriously high mental health rates, and that's just part of our legacy. But we're starting to recognise the power of design in creating healthy environments. Rather than just thinking about trying to minimise the negative impacts on health, we're really trying to reframe that focus. And here you can see this is one of our projects we've recently completed is an urban motorway in Belfast that has been reimagined, but the brief was to tackle mental health. And I think our Public Health Agency has really shown good leadership in adopting a more holistic approach to placemaking and really tackling all of the challenges as part of that. So taking a really wide approach and delivering on that community planning agenda. And then finally, in terms of our fourth theme is really looking at how we recover from the pandemic. So our urban environments don't have big residential populations, and in a sense we are still waiting for our urban renaissance. Our footfall figures are down hugely as we recognise our mono-use town centres and the lack of resilience that they've demonstrated, and our out-of-town retail is obviously doing extremely well. So the pandemic for us has laid bare the health and deprivation inequalities that our urban populations are suffering. And there's been a huge push towards adapting our high streets and focus on active travel, climate change, tackling air pollution, etc. Belfast, for example, recognises it needs to create livable environments in the city centre, and the community plan has set out an ambitious agenda to bring 66,000 new people into the city by 2035. But that requires significant changes in how we provide amenities and services, how we make places walkable and well connected, and apply good green space, good quality green space and amenity value for that. So just to sum up, in terms of the key challenges that we are looking at here in Northern Ireland in terms of planning and design, we have a legacy of this notion that any development is good development. And without a strong design policy environment, there's too much slipping through the net at the moment. So we recognise that this is only one part of the picture, but our policy really needs to be brought up to date, especially at a local level. So until we value good design and build more evidence of its importance to delivering sustainable development, we won't achieve this. Secondly, leading on from this, we must embed good design thinking within our planning authorities. And part of doing this is developing good design skills and good knowledge transfer across the region and across other parts of the UK. So to give you an example, I think we have one, possibly two dedicated urban design officers across the whole of the country within local government, and the resourcing and skills. We're constantly being told by officers as well as elected members that this huge new planning power has been put upon them, but they really need skilled up and they really need the resources and sharing of expertise to help make that happen and for it to be a success. And thirdly, enabling greater collaboration is really important and co-designed by communities themselves. As part of our very centralised and top-down traditional system that we're moving away from, we really need communities to have a greater role in shaping their own environments, and hopefully through the rollout of a stronger policy environment, coupled with greater coordination and focus on evidence and research that demonstrates the value of good design and placemaking, we can achieve this. And I think I just wanted to throw that quote up from the Minister for Infrastructure, who is really championing good design and placemaking as part of the recovery from COVID. And she said this at the NI Planner Live recently, that she believes good blue and green infrastructure will not only assist the greening of urban environments and facilitate better water management, but support safer, cleaner, sustainable safe spaces that allow interconnectivity, provide for recreation, help communities to connect and thrive economically and socially. So there is a big push towards that at the moment. And we're starting to hear really good things about these priorities. So she has acted and appointed a walking and cycling champion for the region, who's reviewing our street design and trying to embed a culture change towards people and away from cars. She's also identified a new blue and green infrastructure fund and recognised the importance of climate resilience, active travel, mainstreaming our SUDs throughout developments, and reframing how we understand infrastructure as not being just those hard, really strategic pieces of infrastructure, but the softer pieces of infrastructure that are really important to building good sustainable placemaking. So I think one real success story of design engagement here that's playing out on the ground is the delivery of the Conswater Community Greenway in East Belfast. It's really worked to break down barriers between communities that were traditionally and physically quite divided. And it's realigned a river running through the city to increase flood resilience and reduce the vulnerability of inner city residents living close to it. It's using cultural heritage and identity to create new neighbourhoods and entice people back into living in the city. And I think most significantly for this project that helps for us in demonstrating the value of good design was that for every £1 that was invested into this, a huge study by Queen's demonstrated that there was actually £6 of public benefit that was brought through from the project in terms of for the local economy, for health, and for community ownership and social cohesion, as Heather had referred to previously. And that was as a result of a really collaborative and bringing communities along in that process from the word go. And finally, I think this is the vision that we're developing for 2023. This is the main high street that runs right through Belfast. So we need to bring it right into the city. We need to bring our green spaces and amenity right into our city to help drive forward an agenda for urban living here. And I think that we can progress more sustainable urban living. We can strengthen and adapt our high streets and bring more vibrancy to them at a time when they need them, and create more resilient and responsive environments as a result. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lots of really interesting insights there, both if you're based in Northern Ireland, and I think if you're not based there, in terms of comparative examples of the planning system, and also just good project management and projects out there in the real world. Next, we've got, thank you very much for that, Mura. So next we have Vicky Payne, who is a planner and urban designer working at URBED in Manchester. She is interested in how core principles of urbanism can be supported through strategic spatial planning and design coding. She is motivated by the potential to bake in sustainability at a macro scale through well-considered plans and the opportunities that affords at site level. She's worked on a wide range of projects throughout the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework and the National Model Design Code for the UK, which is obviously very topical at the moment. She believes that everyone should be able to participate in planning and wants to explore how the industry and technology can make this easier. She's a member of the RTPI and a passionate advocate for high quality planning in the UK. And she also, as another aside, gave a very good, chaired a very good session recently looking at how the Canadian planning system works in comparative terms, and is due to, I think, chair another session soon on the American and USA planning system, which I think should be very interesting. So if you want to find details of the recording of the Canada one and the Eventbrite for the US one, if you go on her Twitter feed or something like that, I'm sure you'll find it. So Vicky,
hopefully signposted it there on the first slide. Yeah, so I'm Vicky Payne. I'm a planner and urban designer at URBED. We're an urban design company based in Manchester, and comparatively fairly small company. Urban design is our kind of main work, but we're quite multidisciplinary. As you can see there, we have a lot of different skills within the office. Quite a small company comparatively. And we're also a cooperative, so most of our employees are members and we run the business together. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a bit about design coding, which has become quite a topical issue of late. The numbers that I've added here are the number of times that these various publications use the phrase design code. Most recently, the planning white paper, which is actually quite a small document and uses the phrase 20 times. But as you'll have heard previously, the main thing is the National Design Guide, which leaves a space in part 3 for a National Model Design Code, which is what me and my colleagues and MHCLG are working on at the moment. I just need to put the sharing control panel down so I can actually see what I'm reading. So it says, a National Model Design Code will be published setting out detailed standards for key elements of successful design. So that's what we're kind of working on at the moment. And unfortunately, it's not published yet. We hoped we might be able to talk a bit more about the content of it today. But actually what I'm going to do is just talk about some of the things that we've picked up along the way and some of the research that we've done. Is that moving on? Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't know what design codes are, this is the government definition, so very on brand. Design codes are a set of illustrated design requirements that provide specific detailed parameters for the physical development of a site or area. I've added the emphasis on specific, but I think the key thing in terms of a national model design code is this site or area aspect. Most people, I think, will be quite familiar with design coding at the site level. It's usually a key component of an outline planning permission. So this is just a selection of images that I've pulled from an application that URBED did in Sunderland. And the outline permissions set things like the key access, where you might find active uses, the broad structure of blocks, and setting things like height. But it becomes a bit more complicated when you try to broaden it out into that area component. And when we submitted the bid for the National Model Design Code, we cited some of our experience in this area of trying to do design coding on a more macro scale, one of which was the Urban Design Guide for Nottingham City Centre. So there was a coding aspect to that, although it was guidance, because they had a master plan for the town centre, and part of the design guide was intended to codify certain aspects of that master plan and set rules to make sure that that was followed. We also, this is before my time, but we worked on the Hume Guide to Development, which again is trying to set rules for development at that kind of macro scale and create a code for a wider area. And this one was interesting because there was quite a high degree of community involvement in this project. So you can see there that on that page it's trying to specify for shorter elevations onto main streets, so you've got those connecting streets coming in. But I think the thing, if you go and look at these projects on the URBED website, which you can if you're so minded, you can see that it struggles to get from guidance to what you might expect at site level, which is much more measurable, definable rules. It's one of the things that I think coding on a wider scale has maybe struggled with so far in the UK. And then the other thing that we brought to the Commission, which I think was maybe helpful, is a slightly more global perspective, because my colleague David recently published a book called Climax City, which looked at the way that master planning and development happens more globally in a lot of different contexts. And one of the things that we did as part of this commission was to look at different examples of how design coding is used internationally. So I'm going to very briefly talk about a couple of those. And from that, I do not want you to take that this is exactly how design coding is going to be done in the UK from now on. These are kind of, references that we just looked at. So the first one is France. And in France, design coding is a much more intrinsic part of the planning system, which is a zonal system. So you can see here in Bordeaux, pretty much every part of the city has some kind of zoning designation, and there are design code rules associated with that, which if you were to buy a plot of land in Bordeaux, you would receive that as part of the paperwork that you get when you buy the site. And that means that when you apply for planning permission, all you're really doing is checking that your proposal is in conformity with the code. So in theory, makes it an easier and less bureaucratic experience. This is Miami, and you can see it's a similar sort of zonal approach with codes associated with that. If anything, it's even more fine-grained than the Bordeaux example. And the interesting thing here, I think, is that the zones are actually related to the concept of a transect, which is something that was developed and popularized by a practice called Duane-Plater-Zyberg, which is an American practice. And they kind of codified different typologies from natural all the way to urban center. And you can see that the key on that Miami plan kind of conforms to that transect-based approach. And they don't sit nicely side by side against one another as they do in the transect, but it's how they conceptualize their approach to zoning. And they've taken what was a relatively old concept of the transect, and they've really taken quite a modern approach to it. So if you go on Miami's zoning map website, you can see that they've got a GIS base and a digital facility that lets you see the build out potential of down to like almost the plot level. So you can see how high you can build, like the relationship to the building line, that kind of thing, which is quite interesting. I'm actually going to this is my wrapping up section. I've only got 10 minutes, so it needs to be fairly speedy. But I was going to go through some of the potential things that you need to think about when you're applying a design code approach more widely, and then some of the potential opportunities. So this is representing some of the potential loopholes that you can encounter or unforeseen circumstances. So these skinny skyscrapers in New York are a result of the fact that within New York's code, if you don't build up to the full height extent that you're allowed to, you can sell your air rights to somebody else, which results in these very skinny, tall towers, which is not necessarily what people thought might happen. The second thing is maybe a slight misconception around the amount of work that it takes to do a more coded or zonal process. Generally, we've seen, looking at the international examples, that it's a huge amount of work up front, and then the decision-making process at the end becomes a lot easier. But it's certainly, I would say, a shifting of the work rather than a reduction. Finally, I think this is more of a fear. So there is a concern that when you do design coding more widely, that there's going to be this aesthetic uniformity. And really, I think if you're doing design coding right, you should be coding for like the absolute minimum essential items, and it should still be allowing for quite a lot of stylistic flexibility and a different range of approaches, but setting some key things, you know, like the building line, like heights, that kind of thing. And then ending on a high with some of the opportunities. I think in terms of community engagement, there is a role for design coding to make this a lot more meaningful and a lot more transparent. I think at the moment, communities maybe struggle sometimes with understanding why certain decisions have been made on certain planning applications, and potentially if you get it right, design coding could make this a lot more understandable and a lot clearer, because it should be a measurable rules-based system so people can see why certain development has happened in a certain area. Secondly, the UCL research and the National Housing Audit has shown that the use of design codes at site level results in higher quality development. So you would imagine, if you kind of extrapolate that out, that it's going to result in better development across the UK. And then this is my clumsy visual metaphor for like an easier route through the planning process and a bit more clarity and certainty, because I think the planning process as it stands, it's quite risky for developers. There's quite a lot of uncertainty on both sides, and potentially design codes can help to address that by providing greater certainty for local authorities and developers and communities about what they're going to get at the end of this process. So apologies, that was speedy whistle stop tour, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Vicky. That was a whistle-stop tour, but a very good one. I think that's really important because, as you say, there's an awful lot of reference to design codes at the moment, and it's not always obvious what they actually are. So that was a really helpful summary of the state of play now. And clearly there's going to be quite a lot more in the next few months, one way and the other, to look at and think about. So before the Q&A, we have our final talk today. From Joe Ayoubkhani, who is Associate Planner at Barton Wilmore in Cardiff, also into their Bristol office as well. He is the RTPI's Design Champion for Wales and is part of the Design Commission for Wales's Patch Network. And he's going to give us an update on the situation in Wales. Again, useful insights for cross-comparison purposes, and also, obviously, if you're in Wales, some very direct relevance there. So, Joe, I think we've not got visual for you. Have we got the audio? Can we hear?
Yeah, so Perfect. Can you hear me? Great.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Justin. Great to be speaking with everyone today. Webcam isn't working, but there's a photo of me suited and booted on the screen there. Okay, we've only got 10 minutes and we're running a little bit over time, so I'll keep it brief and just run through the headlines of how the latest version of national policy is currently being applied, the design elements that I take away from the National Development Framework, Welsh Government's COVID-19 recovery response, and finally the Placemaking Wales Charter, which has been developed by Welsh Government and the Design Commission for Wales. But before I get into any of that good stuff, I've put a photo of myself and my son Toby on the screen. I've done so not because I'm training him from an early age to be a town planner, but because we have a law in Wales which is unique here, called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It sets a statutory requirement for all public bodies, including LPAs, to think about how they will affect people now and in the future when they make any decisions. It sets an important context for planning policy and decision making in Wales. So Planning Policy Wales was issued 2 years ago. It completely reworked previous editions and put placemaking and the wellbeing of future generations front and centre. Placemaking is referenced not once or twice, but 77 times in the document. PPW is much more visionary and narrative based when compared with the MPPF, which provides more detailed guidance on implementation. PPW requires that LDPs or local development plans should include a strategic and locally distinctive placemaking vision for the plan area, and site-specific master plans should be prepared. As we've discussed earlier today, many councils don't have in-house design expertise, and capacity and resourcing issues have been flagged as well. With this in mind, and with the focus on making sure that sites are deliverable, there's an increasing need for collaboration between LPAs and site promoters. Early engagement with the Design Commission for Wales as part of their design review is also encouraged. So in terms of decision making, the increased emphasis on well-being has given the LPAs greater confidence to refuse applications on placemaking grounds. The example on the screen is one in Bridgend, which refused an application for 41 affordable homes on the fringes of an industrial estate, owing to it not being the right development in the right place. We're also seeing an increased appetite from the planning minister to flex their muscles and intervene in decision making, taking a different and more negative view to the planning inspectorate. A 300-home appeal in Quigley was recommended for approval by a planning inspector, owing to the council having a significant shortfall of housing and a development plan that only runs until 2021 without a replacement plan being prepared. Despite this, the minister dismissed the appeal on the basis of their commitment to the plan-led system. The last case on the slide was an affordable housing proposal, recommended for approval by the council, but was called in by ministers. The inspector recommended the application's approval, but part of the minister's decision to refuse the application was due to the site's wider context not having been fully considered, and therefore not according with placemaking principles. So I guess the takeaway from all of that is that placemaking and design should be considered as early as possible, and even at the site selection stage, and you should look to involve and collaborate with stakeholders and the Design Commission for Wales in a meaningful way. On to Future Wales 2040, which is currently being prepared by Welsh Government with a view to being published in the spring. We'll have development plan status, so all plans below it will need to be in conformity, and decisions will need to have regard to it. The map on the screen is the spatial strategy set by the Future Wales document. So the document introduces a much greater emphasis on regenerating existing towns and cities, promoting neighbourhoods that are compact and walkable. There's some similarities with the Scottish system that we heard about a bit earlier on. Green belts are proposed in Wales for the first time in a generation to control development and focus it on existing areas. Leveraging the public investment in new metro transport systems across Wales, there's a push for higher density transit orientated development, which is car free. A mix of uses is promoted to create activity and vibrancy. Future Wales suggests that there's a need for a change in the delivery model for house building. Aligning with the increased borrowing powers that councils have, it promotes public sector leadership in the assembly of sites and delivery of development. Increased compulsory purchase powers are also being consulted on in Wales for this purpose. There's a risk that councils may struggle to meet the nation's housing requirements, but there are already some really good examples of local authority delivered council housing schemes in Cardiff and Flintshire. As you'd expect, Green infrastructure to secure biodiversity enhancement is promoted, with councils being required to prepare GI assessments. It's important that you align ecology and landscape into site selection and design at an early stage. So now to look at how things are moving forward post-COVID. The English government's pandemic response focused on keeping the system moving and providing some temporary relaxation to planning regs. The Welsh Government went a step further and did some more strategic thinking about how the planning system can help recovery. 8 policy priorities on the screen now have been set, which have been well received, and it's good to see such a proactive approach being taken. Key policy priorities in the document include building great places to live with access to green space, supporting healthier lifestyles and boosting broadband infrastructure, something that I'd welcome at the moment under lockdown. Support is provided for development in locations where they can be easily accessed by active travel without the need for car or public transport. The key proposals for me are the proposals for a more flexible approach to existing retail and commercial centres and a re-examination of employment allocations, recognising that there's a long-term shift towards working and shopping from home. It's hoped that this will provide greater diversity of uses and vibrancy in town and city centres. Welsh Government are trying to achieve this through a more controlled and measured way, however, not going as far as the English Government, who are currently consulting on granting PD rights to flip town centre uses into resi, something that was discussed a bit earlier on. Finally, the Placemaking Wales Charter has been released. It sets a series of principles to be adopted through the design, construction and management of projects. It's aimed at all involved in shaping the built environment. Design quality charters are not a new concept, with Cambridgeshire having one in place for some time. The West of England are in the process of preparing a similar charter, and developers like Grosvenor and Redrow have also developed similar schemes to drive design and placemaking internally. As a profession, I think planners are well placed to drive the placemaking agenda. Many will have experience of design guidance being ignored or overlooked, such as the low uptake of manuals for streets amongst highway engineers. The Charter provides a lever to enable a step change in approach from other professions engaged in design and development. So that was really quick, because I was conscious of time, but just to conclude, it's a really exciting time, I think, to be involved in planning and design in Wales. Whilst myself and others in the development industry probably don't agree with some of the ministerial decisions being made, the policy landscape puts placemaking and design front and centre, and those are great projects on the horizon to get involved with. So yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Pleasure speaking with you today, and my contact details are on screen if you want to get in touch. Justin, back over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. That was very good on all levels, not least powering through it so quickly. So we've got about 15 minutes left for a bit of a Q&A session. So if all the other speakers can turn their cameras back on and their microphones back on, and that is good. And remember, Joe is still there in the ether, able to comment. Right, okay, there was, I mean, lots of overarching themes. One of the ones that kind of came through was the importance of and the value of working positively with the communities, and there were some good examples given in the different contexts. Given that it's one of the few sort of things that definitely cuts across all sort of 6 speakers, because I'm not a speaker. Any sort of quick comments from those present about insights they've gleaned from their work doing that sort of thing? Because there's an awful lot of stuff written about, you know, community engagement and stuff, and a lot of warm words, but often it's, as we all know, it's quite difficult to actually get meaningful engagement. So given you've all done a lot of good positive work on different aspects of that, any sort of quick comments about what you found actually really cuts through? Starting with Heather, because she has her hand up.
Oh, I thought I'd just circumvent it and just put on my hand, be first to go. I think the main thing is about sustaining engagement. I think quite often there's good examples of community engagement, but it tends to be about a specific moment in time, and actually, you know, then the project moves on and the community doesn't get kept informed. So I think suppose it goes back to that collaboration. I think there are lots of organisations who are working within communities, be it housing associations or community centres or youth groups, that can almost be those community connectors to try and sustain engagement, whilst officers like ourselves go away and actually do the lots of things to make delivery happen, but you don't always have that engagement, ongoing with the community. So I think sustaining engagement and working with the people in the area, being those community connectors, is really important.
Yeah, others want to chip in?
Yeah, just now, well, if I may, just to say that, as an outsider of the planning process, if you like, I think it's all about trust. And, if you introduce words like permitted development and presumed consent and that sort of thing, then from the outset, you're starting to destroy that trust. It's being done to me rather than with me and for me. So, I think, there's some language issues going on here, as well as intent issues that will actually fly in the face of what we really want to do, which is to bring communities with us and to understand that some development is necessary because we want to continue to progress and to house our people and all the things that we need to do.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Anyone else want to chip in?
I can chip in, Justin. Yeah, leading on from those points, I think what we've learned in Northern Ireland is that good engagement starts way beyond things enter the planning system, and early on engagement is so important to achieving the buy-in. What we've noticed here is that actually local communities are driving the change a little bit and actually reacting to the sort of stagnant or sometimes difficult issues that get caught up in our governance system. So actually they're the ones that have really pushed politically for a focus on climate change, and you can see that from we did a post-COVID survey, and 84% of the population want action now on climate change, and they're getting really impatient about the lack of progress towards active travel as well, and they want the infrastructure there to help them change lifestyle behaviours. But actually, so there's something there around they actually can drive the change if they're involved early on and they have the social capital and the ability to collaborate and push those things up the agenda. What we do in USI is always use like a co-design process, apply it to a project. So they are involved very early on and they're helping shape the brief, the process, the vision and the outcomes. And then what we find actually works really well is active piloting of some of the strategies, so that communities are built into that pilot and they're learning themselves and seeing what works and doesn't work. So I think we found some ways around some of the tricky ways that our planning system works that might be useful for other areas to try as well.
Yeah, I think if I just give the kind of Wales perspective, I think really important to have that engagement early on, and that occurs when you're making the plan. And because the lack of resource in local authorities, it's just important to widen that and collaborate with the development industry to get that engagement happening at the right time.
Dave, do you want to say something before we move on? You're muted, Dave. Like performance art. Still muted. Vicky, do you want to comment a bit on the kind of sort of potential role for communities in the design coding process from your sort of perspective? Actually, hold that thought, Vicky. Dave.
Back. Yeah, sorry. Weirdly, there was a delay on that. Yeah, I'd just say that Mike mentioned language. This is really important in my experience. We tend to use planning language and design language, which people just don't understand. And we also tend to use plans. And you know what? Don't understand them either. So where we've had the best effects, we've frequently used models, either digital models or are actually physical models of places to help explain the process and what the ideas are. So it's about understanding your audience, really, understanding that people aren't planners, they're just people, and there are a variety of people, and difficult to reach groups, particularly young people who aren't really interested in this on the surface, but actually for whom it's very important, are worth trying to target that way. So thinking creatively about how you actually engage and who you're trying to bring forward. Who is the community and what might they respond to?
Good stuff. Vicky, as before.
Oh
dear.
Me too.
This really is performance art. Right. Oh well. Okay. So park that thought, and if you want more questions for Vicky, just
okay. The digital voice of the GoToWebinar lady has just told me I've been unmuted, so that's good. Yeah, I don't think I have a huge amount to add other than it's quite consistent with the approach that we tend to take at URBED. And the other thing that maybe is worth talking about is the fact that with a lot of our consultation, the initial stage is about teaching communities the stuff that we maybe recognize, so like the common language and the techniques and things, and is a key part of co-design is actually like giving that information up front and allowing them to participate in the process in kind of equal way. It can be a protest sometimes, you know. Yeah.
Good stuff. While you're there, before the technology fails again, a question's come in, which will then lead on to another question for some others. Will design codes cover health outcomes? Any thoughts on that?
Only in a sort of indirect sense, I guess. Like the way that we're looking at design coding at the moment, there's some. It's primarily physical components of the built environment, and obviously they have an impact on health. I'm a bit limited in terms of what I can say, but we're looking at sort of key themes around like the actual built environment, and then some more cross-cutting stuff about health and well-being that are sort of things that you might talk about in your design code, but they're not necessarily things that you would set rules for, because it's difficult to set a defined rule on those kind of topics. Yeah, that's probably about as much as I can say without revealing secrets.
Yeah, no, we don't need to get sacked.
Dave. Sorry, am I? Yeah,
no,
I mean,
Dave, actually, the next question kind of segues into you. So if you want to kind of cover that in two ways. The question was, how will building for a healthy life and planning by zoning be made compatible together? So any sort of thoughts on that? Then I guess carry on from the other one.
And well, building for a healthy life is, as I tried to emphasize, is really about the process, about going through a process, a creative decision-making process. So I don't think that is necessarily incompatible with zoning. In fact, it probably helps to know where you are going more clearly at the start, rather than debating where that might be. So what we've tried to do is to concentrate people's minds on asking the questions about what's important. I mean, plainly, this is very complex, so you're not going to get a green score necessarily on everything. So but that's fine. You know, it's about making sure that what you're doing for the context that you're doing it in is as right as you can within the framework that you're trying to do it. And that sounds a bit woolly, but it's about making sure that you've considered the questions, making sure that really the constraints and opportunities and the qualities of where you are come forward. Because the danger of not doing that is, if you like, over zoning. So it's deciding what you're going to do and then imposing it on the site. And we can see the effects of that. You know, we're living with those effects.
Yeah. Right, a very specific question. Heather, obviously there's been very little time to digest the MPF4 position statement, but is your first impression one of significant change, slight change, or very little change from NPF3?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think broader in terms of MPF4, it's a 10-year vision, so it's quite significant. I think I'm really pleased to see climate change integrated throughout all the 4 themes. It comes through really strongly. I think, as I said, some of the highlights that I've picked up are things that are just good practice about reusing brownfield first, town centres. So I think it's radical that it's reinforcing some really good planning. If that didn't quite answer the question, I think I'm still digesting it, but it's positive. And I think the thing about the position statement is it's not MPF4, it's the direction of travel. So there's still an opportunity to shape it up. And there's been a lot shaping the content of it. So I think talking about engagement and community engagement, you know, it's already shaped in terms of the process of having a lot of different views feeding into it. So I think it's definitely, I'm really positive about it.
No, that is an entirely fair caveated answer given the circumstances. Sort of following on from that, there's been reference to the 20-minute neighbourhood, and of course other places like the Urban Design Group were talking about the 15-minute neighbourhood, and Matthew Carmona earlier today talked about the 10-minute neighbourhood. And I know there's been some pushback from some people about the very concept full stop. And any thoughts from the panel on that, as it's very much flavour of the month in terms of current thinking about local design and networks and movement?
Yeah, I could go because perhaps I've maybe had a bit more thinking because it came through the programme for government, which was out a number of months ago. So the 20-minute neighbourhood. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an operational concept to try and think about whole place communities and try and think about how can you deliver things that are accessible. So I think in some ways the 10-minute, the 15-minute and the 20-minute is sort of arbitrary, you know, because every place context will, you know, be different. So I think it's a good move. I mean, I think, you know, when I came into planning, we saw a move towards centralising a lot of facilities, you know, big mega kind of health facilities or campuses. And I think it's a good move to try and think about how can you have lots of small incremental things within neighbourhoods. So in some ways, if it's 10 or 15, 20 minutes, as long as they're accessible, walkable, they're high quality, they think about that experience, they've got things that people need, they're doing the job that they're intended to do.
I think there's a danger here, isn't there? Once you start to put a number on something, I can see it happening. Somebody's going to do some calculations and work out that it's, oh no, this is an 11-minute neighbourhood and the whole world falls apart. We can't have that because we've now got a rule. And that's the problem with standards more generally. As a designer, we tend not to like standards like that because they mean minimum standards. And I think we've got to be really careful that that's not so burned into any policies or guidance that we bring out that it stymies initiative. And we start to get the cart before the horse, and we look at quantities rather than the quality, the overall quality of what we're actually delivering.
I think.
Thank you.
It's Joe on the line here. I think for me, so it was piloted in Melbourne. The Paris mayor has kind of championed the 15-minute city, but a lot of the communities who we plan for are pretty rural in nature. So I think we need to think about it a bit more creatively, and you know what uses do we already have that we can double up. So you know, during lockdown, I've popped to the pub down the road to do a bit of work and you know have a cheeky beer afterwards. So there's that kind of doubling up of you know when does a pub become the village hall, when does it become the local community hub for working. So,
yeah.
Oh dear. If you can be really quick, Mura and Mike, because we've run out of time. So like,
yeah,
really
I just wanted to emphasize David's point about quality, not quantity. I actually find it useful as a bit of an analytical tool. We have a program here, an Urban Villages program led by our executive office, and it really is focusing on the most deprived communities. So in terms of understanding what amenities they have access to and what services are missing, I find it more useful up front in the design process and understanding that. And yeah, definitely, I mean, it's not focus more so on the quality of good walkable neighbourhoods rather than the quantity of walking space is so important as part of that, of the delivery of that.
Yeah.
Great. And Mike?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to jump back to what I said in my presentation, rather provocatively. People need to get back to planning rather than reacting and processing, and and that's what we should be doing. And in terms of planning, we need to look at the inclusion in the title really about the future generations. And we've got an aging community, we've got climate change, we've got all these things going on. So how do we design and plan to make sure that our buildings are truly resilient, that don't overheat, the lightweight structures we know will overheat, and I made a big point about they don't burn either, because that's a terrible thing for people if you're caught in that situation. So my point really is that we've got overlapping agendas here going in, where government are trying to force policies through that they have a particular nuance for at this moment in time, but you're going to affect the long-term agenda. So I think we've been really careful to keep planning as planning and doing the right thing for our communities.
And on that profoundly good point, I think we'll have to end the Q&A. I've got to do 2 quick minutes of kind of wrapping up things. First of all, thank you very much to all the speakers and panelists who were all unsurprisingly brilliant. There will be more of this sort of conversation, well, not conversation, but more of these sort of themes and debates that we can put out through the Urban Design Network newsletter. So if you have not joined the RTPI Urban Design Network, then I would recommend you do that, because a newsletter comes out every few months with interesting blogs from the likes of Matthew Carmona did one on the last blog that came out. We have got the next event starting in 2 minutes if you want to go to that. Thank you very much to the people who you've seen in front of the screen, but also thanks very much to Max Tolley and Jenny Devine, who are well, sort of at RTPI HQ behind the scenes doing all the technical stuff. We did sterling work reacting to some rather challenging technological constraints. Max in particular is our Urban Design Network key support person, and he does loads of really valuable work behind the scenes that you often won't see in terms of doing research, writing reports, doing consultation responses. So there's a real value there to what Max and the team do. Also, the Urban Design Network, we're very fortunate to have the likes of the people you see in front of you now, and others as well, such as Julie Tanner, who's very helpful with helping today, but also does lots of other useful things, her national expertise on design review. The network was set up originally partly by Colin Haylock, ex-president of the RTPI, who is again one of our key people, and people like Luke Hilson, who's the West Midlands RTPI chair and also an urban designer. So there's lots of really helpful people who we appreciate their contributions within the network. So thank you very much for attending. This event has been recorded, so you will be able to see again Mike going and shouting at his builder, but more importantly all the other more tangible insights from today. So if you had to nip out to deal with a phone call or something and missed a bit, it will all be online, and no doubt Max will facilitate that recording link being sent to you. And as I said, there are more events coming up, so check them out, and we'll hopefully do something similar to this in 12 months time if we can. Thank you very much everyone, take care, goodbye, have a good Monday.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye everyone.